Sometimes we need to affirm what we know so that we can change it. And maybe that's the silver lining to all this. But it was hard, no doubt. No doubt.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for taking your time out of your day to come join us at the West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club. I'm Sean Farrow. I'm going to be the moderator today. I figure we'll just get started here, although there may be some candidates who come a little bit later. Before I introduce the candidates, I'm going to explain today's format to you. We're going to cover 4 topics today: housing, education, policing, and COVID-19 response. I'm going to ask that each candidate will receive 1 question per topic. Each candidate will have 3 minutes per response. So we ask that each candidate please try to keep within those time limits so everybody gets equal opportunity to speak. I will indicate to each candidate when they have about 1 minute remaining in their response. Please respond directly to the question posed and do not interrupt each other. I have asked you all prior to today to prepare a brief 3-minute opening remark. The order in which everyone will speak has been chosen at random. Catherine Garcia will be first, the NYC Sanitation Commissioner, followed by former Citigroup Executive Raymond McGuire. If she is to join, we would have New School Professor, former Councilor Bill de Blasio, and former Chairwoman of the NYC Civilian Complaint Review Board, Maya Wiley. If she does not, we have former JP Chase Managing Director and founder of NYC Votes, Art Chang, followed by technology entrepreneur and professor at Purdue University, Eddie Cullen. After him will be former executive director and chief executive officer of Phipps Neighborhoods, Diane Morales. After her, number 7 will be environmental advocate Aaron Foldenauer, followed by 8, former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Obama, Sean Donovan. And number 11, Councilman Carlos Machaca. I'm sorry if I mispronounce it. Machaca, thank you. And later we will have City Comptroller Scott Stringer. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with Ms. Garcia. If you can please present your 3-minute opening remark.
Thank you so much for having me, Sean. I really appreciate being here and getting to see everyone. Happy New Year. I'm Catherine Garcia. I'm running for New York City Mayor. I am a born and bred Brooklynite who went to public school and raised my children in New York City, one of whom I discovered when he contributed to my campaign views himself as a creative technologist. I had not heard that job title before, but he's doing interesting things with his young life. And I have been the go-to crisis manager for the New York City for the last 14 years that I've been in public service. You may not know my name, but if you turned on your water, that was the work that I was doing as in charge of your water and sewer system. And then since 2014, I was Commissioner of Sanitation, the interim chair of NYCHA, responsible for eliminating childhood lead poisoning, and during COVID, responsible for delivering at its height over 1 million meals a day and another 500,000 to ensure that our fellow New Yorkers who were sick or couldn't go out were fed. But I'm running for mayor because I have a philosophy that we need to rebuild our economy. Nothing is affordable if you don't have a job, but you cannot do that if we do not have schools that are functioning better, that we have sanitation services, and that we feel safe in our communities. But we need to do that while looking towards economic mobility and making it this an economy that works for everyone, as well as thinking about climate change and ensuring that as we rebuild, we do it with an eye towards resiliency and towards protecting our environment for our children and future generations. And with that, I am going to turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Garcia. Next, I would ask Raymond McGuire to give his brief opening remark. Mr. McGuire? We will keep moving on. I will turn now to Art Chang. If you can please give your opening remark.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. Happy New Year, everybody. My name's Art Chang. I love this city. To see our city in crisis gives me great pain. It doesn't have to be this way. We've kicked the can down the road for far too long on complex interconnected problems. We need change, structural change, fundamental change. I was born in Jim Crow Atlanta. I grew up in an all-white school district in Akron, Ohio, where I faced racism on the street and domestic violence at home. I know the critical importance of civil rights. My first grade teacher refused to teach me because her brother was fighting people who looked like me in Vietnam. I quickly learned that when a group of white boys walked down the street toward me, it was for my own safety that I would have to cross the street. I know that equity begins at home because often I didn't know if my mother was going to be alive. And I knew that education was a doorway to freedom for me and my brother and sister. My mother risked her life and her own safety to bring me to an exam that qualified me for a scholarship to go to boarding school. And then subsequently, and probably not surprisingly, I became the second man to graduate with a women's studies degree from Yale. I moved to New York in 1985 with $400 in my pocket. I went bankrupt in my first startup, but ultimately I found love, raised a family, and built a home here. I have 30 years in public service. The New York City Corporation Council's office, the New York State Empire State Development, Safe Horizon, Brooklyn Public Library, CUNY. I was the first Asian appointed to the Campaign Finance Board. I was a co-creator of NYC Votes. I was the first chair of the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee, and I was chair of Brooklyn Tech's SLT. I also have a parallel 30-year career in the private sector, starting as a waiter and a carpenter, but all my other work has been on improving New York City's industries. I know how to rebuild the city, broadband, climate, environment, and the streets. I know how to be great partners with our nonprofits to deliver quality education and the arts. I know how to fundamentally improve essential government services. So I ask why? Why do we have one-size-fits-all strategies? Why don't we work more from the bottoms up? Why aren't our government services more personalized? My platform focuses on jobs, families, and communities to respond at crises at hand, and ultimately to create universal childcare, truly affordable housing, small business as the engine of economic growth, the reinvigorated arts and entertainment sector, education that meets each student where they are, public safety for all, and the climate crisis which is here today. Albert Einstein says that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking used to create them. I bring different thinking to bring about real change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go a little bit out of order and go back to Mr. McGuire. The floor is now yours. You have 3 minutes for your opening remark.
You're going to me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me. I did not recognize that. Thank you very much for all the assembly leaders and all the district members, and also to Madam Dickens. I have long admired and respected the leadership, and it's in large part because of you that we are here. Listen, and I first have to acknowledge what took place in Washington. The word tells me that a nation should not lift up a sword against a nation, and we find ourselves there. And a vision that I have is making New York City the beacon for a united city and a united people. I came to New York, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. I love New York. It is where I met my wife and where we have raised our 3 children. I came from the other side of the tracks, raised by a single mother who was a social worker who raised me and my 2 brothers along with my grandparents. I didn't know my father, and she sacrificed. She sacrificed for me and my 2 brothers to make certain that we would have a life. And sometimes she had to, in that sacrifice, debate on whether or not she was going to put food on the table, or whether or not she was going to put tithes in the church offering, or whether or not she was going to pay the power and light bill. So I know what it's like not to have. I know what it's like to have to wash the tin foil to make certain that you can use it the next day, or to put the small pieces of soap together to make certain that you convince yourself that you have a bar of soap. And so it's with that lived experiences, I know what it's like not to have. And I also have been fortunate to come to New York City. And when I came to New York, I had 3 things. I had a great education because of my mother's sacrifices. I had a great education. I had no money, and I had a lot of debt. And I've been able to be in this city and to be in a leadership position leadership position for almost 4 decades, the longest standing head in a business like mine in the history of Wall Street. And I've been able to develop relationships across the spectrum of this city, from the streets to the suites. And I take my lived experiences, I take what I've been able to accomplish in business for 30 some odd years, the only person who looked like me who was able to do anything close to that. And I take the relationships that I've been able to develop and lead this city to the greatest economic recovery that this city's ever seen, the most inclusive economic recovery that this city has ever seen. And that's why I'm running for mayor. And I look forward to earning your support.
Thank you. Mr. Cullen. Your turn.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eddie Cullen, and I am a Bronx native. I actually grew up in Manhattan to a 32 BJ building maintenance worker for the last 30 years, and I come from a little bit of a different background. I was pretty much shocked into action. As you guys can see, I'm probably one of the younger people in the race, and I'm super excited to be here. A little bit about my background. My grandfather and his 7 brothers fought in World War II, and they all survived. So they hold the American World War record for most fought in a war and to survive. They came back in the Bronx. So my family's been around for quite some time up in the Bronx. And I'm humbled just to even be here. I was shocked into action. I just want to help. So I'm coming from a little bit of a different perspective. I graduated from Xavier High School on 16th and 5th, between 5th and 6th Avenue, Fordham University. I completed the Jesuit Volunteer Corps after college. So I lived on $85 a month working with the homeless and the poor and teaching high school, something that I really care about. Following college, I was a professional rugby player in Australia for a little bit, came back, and then I went rogue as a teacher. So I was a teacher originally, and then I went rogue into the startup world. I was the first employee at company.co. In Midtown Manhattan, think of Silicon Valley in a skyscraper. That's pretty much how we approached it. Following that, I opened a company called Bronx.tech, which was a corporate consulting company for a little bit. And then I was shaken by tragedy. My father actually had a heart attack on Christmas morning, 2018, and he passed away in front of me. And his funeral was actually January 8th, the same day as Donald Trump's Oval Office speech. And I promised myself from that point on, I would do what was right, even if it was hard. So I was a co-founder of the Harlem Tech Summit, techsummitseries.com. And I've just tried to do whatever I can to help people. And that's why I'm running this race. My uncle works for the MTA. My aunt works in Manhattan College. I am a native New Yorker. And I'm super excited to help in any way that I can. And finally, I just want to offer my thoughts and prayers to Donald Trump's Twitter account. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Next up is Ms. Diane Morales. Soon.
Hi, sorry about that.
No worries.
Hi, all. First of all, thank you all so much to the organizers and the members of the West Side Progressive Democratic Club for inviting me to be here with you all this afternoon. It's really, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share my background, my experiences and qualifications with you all. So first of all, I want to acknowledge, I need to acknowledge that this past week was tinged with first, the light of possibility after the wins of the immense Black organizing that took place in Georgia, only to be overshadowed by the insurrection of those who would essentially deny Black and brown people the ability to engage equally in democracy. These reactions, I think, are inextricably linked. It's tied back to the fact that this country is rooted in the denial of Black freedom that has in turn oppressed the liberation of so many. And this is also a critical part of the reason why I'm in this race and the issues that I seek to address. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm not a career politician. My candidacy is 100% rooted in a grassroots, people-powered movement that is in fact reflective of New Yorkers who are ready to forge a new social contract for this city. I've spent my entire life working in communities, shoulder to shoulder with those who are seeking to live in dignity and provide for their families. And I'm not beholden to the political establishment, nor is my team comprised of those who benefited from politics as usual. I am an Afro-Latina who was born and raised in Bed-Stuy. I am a first-generation college graduate and the single mother of 2 young adults. While I've navigated those challenges of my own personal life, I've also been working in low-income Black and brown communities, helping families to move out of poverty through providing increased access to education and career opportunities. My personal and my professional experiences have made me aware of the systemic and structural barriers that work to really prevent true equity and justice for so many in our communities. As the leader of human service organizations, I've developed cross-sector partnerships between employers, higher education institutions, and community organizations that have provided career pathways and exceeded national averages for both promotion and retention in the healthcare field. I've also developed a model for supporting educational programming and after-school programs that was replicated by the Department of Youth and Community Development in every after-school program in New York City. My executive experiences creating alternatives to help families overcome challenges have given me a really unique perspective on what it will take to fundamentally transform how we operate. I'm running for mayor because I'm ready to tackle the root causes of these problems. We're living in an unprecedented time that calls for the radical reimagining of what is possible. It's critical that our leadership be reflective and representative of those of us who have struggled the most, and not those that are tied to the old ways of operating. New York City needs leadership that is unapologetic about the need for us to create a new social contract that will center and elevate the communities that have historically been left behind. I'm not afraid to take on and challenge the status quo. I'm not promising to get New York City back to normal. I'm actually promising to create a New York City that has never existed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morales. Mr. Foldenauer, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. My name is Aaron Foldenauer. I'm an environmental advocate and candidate for mayor of New York City. And it's great to be here today in West Harlem, albeit virtually, because my very first apartment in New York City 15 years ago was on 119th in Amsterdam. So I was very close to your neighborhood, and I've done advocacy work in and around your community. I've run for city council. I ran for office in 2017 here in Lower Manhattan and have been an advocate in the community ever since. And even before I ran for office, I fought for equal access to the Fort Washington Armory just north of you in Washington Heights. I'm a lawyer by trade, and I represented a youth mentoring organization that a track and field entity was seeking to remove from their offices. I saved that youth mentoring organization in Washington Heights, preserved their mission, and fought for their rights to use therapy dogs to comfort troubled teens. And I am the only candidate for mayor now with a comprehensive platform seeking to get New York City moving again. Here in New York City, we have upwards of 1 million people who are unemployed. Back in August, I was the only candidate for mayor to stand up for the rights of restaurants to reopen and serve their customers. Our business owners, our waiters, our waitresses do not want an unemployment check. They want to get back to work. I fought for their rights to get back to work, and Governor Cuomo, several weeks after I started my advocacy efforts, caved. So I have a proven track record of advocacy in your community and throughout New York City. So it's great to be here today to speak to the specific needs of you and your colleagues and members there in West Harlem. Again, my name is Aaron Foldenauer. My website is aaron4nyc.com. I look forward to speaking with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Donovan, the floor is now yours.
Sean, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here today with my fellow candidates, with the entire West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club. And I look forward to telling you a little bit about my background and why it is I love this city. But I do want to start by remembering the words of John Lewis, given the events of this week. He said, "The vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democracy." I remembered those words with joy in my heart on Tuesday night, and I remembered those words with horror in my soul on Wednesday. 30 years ago, I met John Lewis when I was a student retracing the route of the Freedom Rides and he became a friend, a hero, and a mentor for my entire career. And his leadership is one of the reasons that I've chosen a path for the last 30 years in economic and racial justice to end homelessness in this country. And it's one of the reasons why on my very first day as a formal candidate for mayor, I announced that I would be the first mayor in the history of the city to have a chief equity officer reporting directly to me. And I said, every issue is an issue of equity. The other reason I'm running for mayor is because I'm a lifelong New Yorker who grew up in a different time of crisis. As a child walking to school, I watched homelessness exploding on our streets and asked myself, how can it be that in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest country on earth, families are sleeping on our streets? I watched neighborhoods like Harlem and the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn crumbling, literally burning to the ground. And that lit a fire in me to go to work on behalf of this city that I love. I started volunteering in a homeless shelter, and when I finished school, I came back to work for a nonprofit, rebuilding those very same neighborhoods I'd seen burning. In fact, my very first affordable housing that I rebuilt was in Harlem, and it began a deep and long relationship with community organizations, residents, leaders, nonprofits in Harlem, helping to rebuild from the crisis that I'd seen as a child. My 30-year career has taught me what it means to lead through crisis. I was housing commissioner in this city in the wake of 9/11. And in fact, my background taught me that when Columbia wanted to expand on the west side of Harlem, I went to work with Donald Notice and his team at West Harlem Group Assistance to make sure that every resident of an HDFC could stay in their community even more affordably than they were before Columbia decided to expand. Because of my work in New York, President Obama asked me to be the housing secretary for this country in the midst of the worst housing crisis of our lifetimes. And when Sandy hit our shores, he asked me to go to work making sure we rebuilt better and stronger and safer. And if no good deed goes unpunished, he asked me to be our budget director, overseeing our $4 trillion budget, and to bring down our budget deficit faster than any time since World War II, while still investing in critical priorities like healthcare and jobs and housing. And 3 weeks into my time as budget director, Ebola hit, and I went to work with Dr. Fauci and all of our other leaders across the federal government to make sure that a global health threat didn't become a pandemic that cost hundreds of thousands of Americans and tens of thousands of New Yorkers their lives. But I'm not just the most deeply experienced candidate in moments of crisis like this. I also believe, because you are the West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club, that I need to make the argument that I'm the most progressive candidate in this race, because I've made progress at a scale that no one else has on the deepest issues of inequality in this country. I led the strategy for President Obama that dramatically reduced homelessness. In fact, working with Michelle Obama, we ended veteran homelessness in more than 80 cities and states. I led the charge to give the Fair Housing Act of 1968 real teeth. In fact, so much so that President Trump was attacking my work, saying that we were destroying the suburbs because we wanted to make sure every Black and brown person in this country could choose where to live. And when it comes to climate change, LGBTQ rights, and so many other issues, I have been a leader as well. I was the first cabinet secretary in history to endorse marriage equality and led the charge to create the equal access rule that made landmark progress for transgender people in this country. Because of this experience in crisis and as a progressive leader, I believe that I am the right candidate, not just to repair and rebuild this city, but to reimagine it as a city that works for everyone. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Councilman Carlos Macheca, we will ask you to give your brief opening remark. Thank you.
Hi, buenas tardes. I'm Carlos Menchaca, city council member in District 38 in Brooklyn, and I want to be your next mayor. I want to say hello to everyone here at the West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club. Thank you for being here. I know that a lot of you have been waiting for this moment to get to know us. And so I hope that in the course of today, you get to know a little bit more about the candidates. We are in a ranked choice voting world. And what makes that really beautiful is that you're going to see a lot of beautiful ideas come out to address some of the most critical issues that we have been facing as New Yorkers. I come to you with a lot of experience. Over the last 15 years, I've worked solely for the New York City municipal government uh, in Brooklyn and citywide. I've been a city council member. I'll be finishing off my 8th year in the city council and chairing the immigration committee. I've really understood the vulnerable nature of some of our communities, like the immigrant community, public housing community. And in this work, I have become familiar with something that I think that we are lacking right now in our city that we need to change, and that's courage. Through my last 8 years, I have stood up to developers. I have stood up to even my own colleagues in moments where we have moved to bring terrible rezonings in our communities, or in my neighborhood, have confronted a developer where they now removed their application, and that was the Industry City rezoning. Also, there are 4 new jails on their way with a price tag of over $9 billion that not only should we reconsider, but as mayor, I will stop that and bring it back to the community so that we can take those billions of dollars and invest in something what I call a Green New Deal for the city of New York, a municipal Green New Deal, so that we can imagine our economy and actually get people back to work. So much of that you're going to hear in the next few months. And so I'm excited to hear from the other candidates as well, because I'd like to kind of get more ideas. Part of the leadership style that I have is one that is collaborative and one that I want to bring to the mayor's office. You're also going to see a brand new city council. So you're going to need a mayor that understands how the council works and can respect it for who they are, the people's house. Thank you so much. And I look forward to this discussion today.
Thank you much. Thank you all the candidates. We're going to turn to our first topic, which is housing. I'm going to start with Ms. Garcia. Ms. Garcia, you were previously tasked with leading the city's efforts to abate lead paint exposure in children, thus giving you the firsthand look at how bad things can be in public housing. New Yorkers have suffered from decades of federal disinvestment. Sorry, that's my timer there. Disinvestment of NYCHA, which has led to hundreds of thousands of New York City residents living in appalling conditions. What will you do to secure funding for NYCHA's capital needs and operating costs?
Sean, that's a great question. And being the interim chair of NYCHA was extraordinarily eye-opening to me. It is 400,000 of our neighbors who had been living in really quite decrepit conditions due to years of disinvestment. And as what I would say is, why is anyone surprised? We didn't put oil in the car for 20 years and the engine blew up. I am very supportive of the RAD program. I've been to people's apartments, to tenants' apartments who've gone through this program, which leverages Section 8 dollars. And they are so proud of their apartments. They're proud of being able to invite their families over. They want to give you a tour of their new bathroom. I've seen how it can make a difference immediately in those people's lives. But I'm also supportive of what is going to happen, hopefully with the state, in terms of creating a housing trust to leverage additional funding from the federal government on tenant protection vouchers. We need to be driving as much money as quickly as possible into those apartments, into making it so the elevators work. It's a danger to people that they can't get up and down in their buildings. I know there have been workarounds. There have been workarounds at grand houses where people were taught how to do CPR because they might not be able to get downstairs if they had an emergency. We have to change the whole paradigm. But public housing is an investment and it is infrastructure in the city of New York. So we need to make sure that we are executing on the plans that we have. They don't need a new plan. They need us to get moving today on boilers, elevators, rooftops, and the individual kitchens and bathrooms that we know they need.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn next to Mr. McGuire. Mr. McGuire, I'm also going to keep with housing here, assuming that he pops back on the screen momentarily. There we are. How will you improve access to affordable, decent housing, including both safe and fairly regulated rental units and home ownership, without the risk of pushing existing low-income residents out of their communities? You're on mute, Mr. McGuire. There we go.
We good now?
Yes.
Thank you. Housing is one of the most fundamental issues that we'll have to confront. In the vision I have for New York, the platform is threefold. First is the economy. You got to get the jobs back. Second, it's quality of life and safety and security. And the third is education. On the economy, a fundamental premise that I have is 500,000 jobs for New Yorkers, focus on the infrastructure. A fundamental part of infrastructure is housing. In the early part of the 2000s, we built 2.2 units of new housing per every job. Today it's 0.5. We have in NYCHA homes now one of the most deplorable set of conditions that exist anywhere. 9,000 children exposed, 9,000 homes exposed. So we need to build affordable housing, truly affordable housing. And part of my vision would be to have us focus on infrastructure, and a fundamental component of that infrastructure is to build affordable housing. And I would make certain that when projects that we've identified here, like HQ2 and Industry City, that the community gets involved in every large project that we identify to build affordable housing. One of the mistakes that were made was not to have community involvement. We need to have community involvement, and we need to do this around the boroughs. What has taken place today is that the demand for homes has far exceeded the supply for homes. And we need to make sure that we build hundreds of thousands of homes to be able to accommodate those who are low income, who pay 50 to 60% of their income now in rent. And that's not sustainable. And part of my vision for the recovery, the greatest comeback that we've ever seen, is the most inclusive, which by definition has to include affordable housing.
Thank you. Turning now to Art Chang. Mr. Chang, on your website, you say we must extend the eviction moratorium and impose a foreclosure moratorium through March 2022 and cancel all accrued rental debt and interest during this period. However, just this week, you told the New York County Politics newspaper that although you expressed support for the current eviction and foreclosure moratorium, you did not believe that we should be canceling rent, noting that landlords must pay their mortgages. If elected, how would you handle this crisis?
That's a great question. And let me actually just size up the problem. Right now, we have actually about 600,000 people living in NYCHA houses. There are 200,000 pending eviction cases in housing court, which, you know, if you were to extrapolate out, could actually mean the entire population of Boston. This is the size of our housing crisis. We have a city that has an average household income of $69,000. The need for truly affordable housing is absolutely enormous, but we have to stop the bleeding right now. So here's why I think the eviction moratorium and the foreclosure moratorium that have been acted are just simply kicking the can down the road. Because we're not talking about the third player, which is really the mortgage finance companies. What we have is a situation where tenants pay landlords who then pay their mortgages. So if the landlords can't get long-term extensions on their mortgages, and then where are they going to turn? Property has been one of the great places where immigrants and people of color have actually come in over generations and been able to build up intergenerational wealth. And right now we're putting all of that at risk. So what I'm proposing is a 2-year moratorium, retroactive to April 1st, 2020, and then going out to March 31st, 2022 for eviction moratorium and foreclosure moratorium that includes houses and small businesses. And then work with the mortgage companies, mortgage investors, to be able to have up to a 2-year payment-free period, which is done, you know, in a variety of that in 2007 in the last mortgage crisis. So if we extend the mortgages by 2 years, providing a payment-free period, then landlords who want to pass through that benefit to their tenants can do so. And we can wipe out the accrued debt of people who are subject to this. The other tool that the city has at its disposal is its first lien position on delinquent property taxes. And the city can take a much more aggressive position in enforcing that, using that first lien position to really think differently about how we keep people in their houses, keep small businesses in their stores, and preserve the fabric of our communities.
Thank you very much. Turning next to Mr. Cullen. Ms. Cullen, on your website, it lists your campaign philosophy, which includes inclusive capitalism. Currently, we're in the midst of a housing crisis. If you are elected, how does your campaign philosophy of inclusive capitalism lead to an increase in affordable housing for working families, single mothers, homeless veterans, and disabled mentally ill residents, while further addressing the racial and socioeconomic inequities within New York City?
Absolutely. So to give some perspective quick on inclusive capitalism, it's just a history of where I'm coming from. So I did the Jesuit Volunteer Corps right after college, lived on $85 a month, taught high school, been really engaged with folks through what inclusive capitalism is. So impact investment, the greatest modern example I can give is think of Robert Smith's 2% rule. So when he talked to corporations saying, let's take 2% and invest that back into communities, that's a good example. So now in terms of affordable housing, there's a couple of things that I would do. We have to look at different models of creation, right? So when you look at homelessness, I would invite someone like a Homeboy Industries from LA to come over here. They've done a great job basically giving workforce, mentoring skills and everything to incarcerated folks. So I look to work with developers and communities to come up with just new models. We need new models, right? So in terms of affordable housing, let's look back over the last 100 years. We have to go really far back. I think sportswear is the reason why we're in this affordable housing crisis, because we lost the garment industry through manufacturing. So since then, we've built a foundation on a house of cards, and I think we need to go back. So as an example, I would take someone like Secretary Donovan, who has the skills of housing, put him in a room with economists, and then over 6 months, almost redesign the system. I think redlining, systemic racism is a real thing. But I don't think it's anyone's fault nowadays. I think it just happened over the history of time. So one thing that I am going to introduce is I think good capitalism, let's use inclusive capitalism as the example, is something that I like to call the birthright fund. So the Never Forget Birthright Fund, let's use compound interest as a form of good capitalism. One of my things is giving $6,750 to every child in New York City, letting that accrue over time, and then 65 years, you literally will have $1 million and you can retire a millionaire. So in terms of affordable housing, we're going to look at models like that. Opportunity zones. We haven't leveraged opportunity zones in the right way. And I think people look at them as bad, but I don't see it that way. Second Chance Farms is a good example. They actually created a housing and farming facility for former incarcerated folks. And what I would do is something similar to homelessness. Another example is take a look at the zone in Phoenix. So Phoenix created a zone for the homeless in which they used different sorts of models to create an opportunity for homeless to come. I'm an educator, so let's educate. Let's create CUNY degrees for folks. Let's create, let's create opportunities for housing that integrate education. So from the bottom up, I would be coming up with different plans that can actually help. One example, I only have a minute left, but I would use opportunity zones. I would invite Homeboy Industries, Second Chance Farms, and I would work with organizations to come up with a new plan, leveraging knowledge such as Secretary Donovan's, and then approaching, someone like a Diana Morales, who really understands the community. And then to fight systemic racism, we got to go back, fight redlining, come up with a new system, and make sure this house of cards doesn't fall.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Ms. Morales. See if she pops up there. There we go.
All right, I'm here.
Ms. Morales, what is your long-term vision to end homelessness in New York City? And how will you guarantee safe, healthy, and permanently affordable housing in New York for New Yorkers living on the streets or in shelters?
Great, thank you for that question. We've talked a lot about the homelessness issue, and right now it is at unprecedented crisis levels. It was an issue before COVID-19. It is more of an issue even now. We cannot separate the issues of public health, public safety from housing, from accessibility to housing. So I think when I think about this, there's a couple of different ways I think we need to approach it. The first thing is that we need to prioritize right now housing our homeless in order to get this current public health crisis under control. That means looking at how we might be able to repurpose current spaces, current vacant spaces, spaces that have been vacated as a result of the pandemic, whether that be commercial storefronts or hotel rooms. We need to actually get housing for everyone right now. We also need to move towards stronger rent control so that we can put a cap on the skyrocketing prices. We need to protect and enforce the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act and work with housing justice organizers in order to do that. We need to look at implementing land value taxation. We need to look at also a vacancy tax, I believe, in terms of generating additional resources. We also need to better use what we do have access to at the moment, whether that be land banks so that we can repurpose and manage vacancies and urban decay. We also need to think about moving away from fundamentally, I think the framework, the speculative for-profit framework of providing housing in New York City, which is, I believe, at the root of some of the disparities and inequities that we are plagued with today. That means moving towards mixed income, city-led, community-led development, really focusing on partnering with nonprofit developers and affordable housing developers, and stricter negotiations on profit caps with private developers. I also believe that we need to look really and commit to the idea of democratizing home ownership and housing in New York City through community land trust, through participatory zoning that looks fundamentally different from what exists right now, and through really increasing housing stock to a cooperative housing model. I would also commit to creating a homelessness and a committee to end homelessness over the next 10 years that would actually engage a task force of experts and organizers to address the issue over the long term.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Mr. Foldenauer. Mr. Foldenauer, you are currently suing your big name landlord in the financial district. If elected mayor, you would represent millions of New Yorkers whose homes and apartments are a far cry from that of the homes and apartments in financial district. Many tenants in New York face a plethora of issues such as lead paint, lack of hot water, and other issues. Many New Yorkers do not have the resources to go after their landlord. If you become mayor, how do we go about improving the conditions for all New Yorkers?
Thank you for the question, Sean. If I'm elected mayor, I will stand up for the rights of all tenants in New York City. We need fair, affordable housing in New York City. And you're right, most people are not lawyers such as myself. There are many landlords here in Lower Manhattan who accepted government money after the September 11th attacks in order to commit to build rent stabilized housing in New York City. And a lot of those landlords have skirted the law. And you're right, many tenants do not have the resources that I have to stand up for their rights. We know, for example, in criminal courts that innocent people are locked up every day and few people do things about that. So with respect to tenants, we need to make sure that they are able to assert their rights in courts. The New York City Council passed a law several years ago giving certain tenants access to counsel. That's a good first step. We also have to make sure we look at the other side of the coin as well. I'm the only candidate for mayor who has set forth a comprehensive platform with an eye towards the rights of small property owners. Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers have made an investment in this city by purchasing property. They have rights too. I'll give you one example. Property tax payments are due now in New York City. And during this pandemic, those property tax bills still must be paid. And those property tax assessments are unfairly based on land values from several years ago. In other words, pre-pandemic levels. And even those land values are inflated because of artificial real estate speculation. So we do need to look out for the rights of small property owners. There are also tens of thousands of small property owners who have purchased housing and have chosen to rent out that housing to tenants. Small property owners are actually some of the most reasonable landlords to deal with in this city. And if we allow our small property owners to go bankrupt, then the hedge funds will take over, the big corporations will take over, and then we'll be left with less sympathetic landlords in the future. So I've set forth a comprehensive platform, both to protect tenants and both also to make sure that we have reasonable protections for our small property owners who've invested in this city. Thank you for the question, Sean.
No problem. Thank you very much for your response. Turning now to Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan, HPD, or Housing Preservation and Development, schedules emergency repairs to HDFCs and allows the contractor to self-certify without providing concrete proof that the work was completed. Should this practice be allowed to continue? And if not, what change will you make to this practice?
So Sean, thank you for making housing the first issue we talked about today. As I said earlier, I've dedicated 30 years of my life to making sure New Yorkers have better, safer, more affordable housing. And I'd love to talk more about NYCHA, about how we end the terrible problem of homelessness in this city and my record of doing that. But I'll focus on the HDFCs for just a moment, because it's an important issue citywide. It's an especially important issue in Harlem, where so many of the foreclosed buildings that HPD has helped to rebuild over the years, that I helped to rebuild in the 5 years that I led HPD, are at risk at this moment, as you rightly put out. Let's be clear that in a moment where particularly Black and brown New Yorkers in Harlem and across this city are desperately concerned about gentrification and being pushed out of their neighborhoods, one of the issues that I would do dramatically more about as mayor is to build homeownership programs that ensure that we build Black and brown wealth in this city, and that we make sure that we're growing, not displacing the population of low and middle income New Yorkers who can stay, raise their families, and thrive in this city. HDFCs are a critical part of that solution, as you know, and have been one of the tools over the years that we've used to create homeownership and build Black and brown wealth. And specifically to your question, the idea that we have been enforcing and taking away ownership from those families is a terrible disgrace. Specifically, what I would do is, first of all, put in place much more flexible policies to forgive tax debt. I would provide more flexibility for the interest rates and for the back charges that many HDFCs own. And I would provide more resources to allow them to do renovations on those units as well, to take care of the challenges they have with HPD violations. And specifically, I would bring, not just to this issue, but to so many others, a much deeper commitment on the city's behalf to using the technology that's now available in so many cities across this country to document that repairs have actually been done, and to hold contractors responsible so that we ensure that the residents of HDFCs in Harlem and across the city actually get the decent, affordable housing that they pay for.
Thank you very much. Carlos Menchaca, you are the last person. Menchaca, excuse me, I keep mispronouncing your name, apologies. With the final question on housing here. According to our city comptroller, Scott Stringer, the city funding is going to the wrong places and 40 million per year should be taken from Battery Park City Authority over the next 10 years and put towards public housing. Some of that money will help address some of our housing needs, but not all. How would you go about creating more affordable housing in New York? And how would you make sure it's actually affordable and sustainable?
Thanks, Sean, for that question. And I think the $40 million is a drop in the bucket in what we need to invest. I think that even in this forum, you're hearing about programs that have been implemented over the last few decades. They don't work. They don't work because the city is not investing, the state and the federal government, but we're here to be talking about the mayor's role. We're not investing the number of dollars that we can from our capital budget to actually build out closer to 100% affordable projects. The mayor and Alicia Glenn, and this is the de Blasio administration, really focused on private sector investment that doesn't get us to the deeper affordability. And this is why in my district, I refuse to even consider many of the ULURP changes to housing because they weren't affordable. The two that I supported were 100% affordable in our communities. That's where we need to get to, but it requires funding. And so that's where the capital budget can come in. And this is where the Green New Deal concept comes in, where we can actually build this housing. There's a project right now that I want the West Side to focus in on, and that's in 4th Avenue in Sunset Park. We're in the middle of a ULURP right now, and I'm asking HPD to create a new program because they don't have a program where they can bring funding within an MIH project. The MIH program does not get us to that. And so this is just about putting money where our policies are. I think the other component to this is a public bank, and I think you've heard some of this conversation today. I think specifically Diane Morales was talking about this, that we need to bring in new infrastructure to invest. The city can invest in a public bank at better rates that keep the profits here. So much of our affordable housing is connected to these foreign banks and foreign investments that doesn't get us where we need to get to.
Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you. We finished our housing topic. Turning now to policing, but before we get that, we are joined by new school professor, former counsel to Bill de Blasio, and former chairwoman of the NYC Civilian Complaint Review Board, Maya Wiley. Ms. Wiley, I will allow you for 3 minutes if you want to give a brief opening remark.
Thank you so much. And I am so appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you all and to be here with all the other candidates. You know, we're all here because we love this city and we care about this city. And I'm running as a non-traditional candidate, as someone who's never run for political office before, because I know that we can be a city where we can all live with dignity. And dignity means development without displacement. Dignity means a school system that sees all our children as excellent. Dignity means jobs with a future. Dignity means knowing that we have the public back in public safety, that means we're safe from crime, but we're also safe from police violence. And I'm running because, as someone who's spent 30 years as a racial justice advocate, having gone to law school, to be a civil rights lawyer, to fight for things like education equity and funding, to fight for access to healthcare for communities of color, to fight to ensure that we actually focused on developing whole communities, and that all our people, no matter what we look like, no matter who we love or how we worship, no matter whether we have a big bank account or no bank account at all, that we all count. And when I was in City Hall, you know, I went in not knowing Mayor Bill de Blasio, but I did go in believing deeply that, as an advocate that had spent 25 years working on all these issues, that it was city government that had the opportunity to be transformative, because it is city government that touches every resident's lives in all these ways, from housing to healthcare to education to safety, and that it is possible to be transformative. But what it requires is what I saw and was grateful for the opportunity to do there. It means putting people first, being accountable to them, and showing government and leading it through a process that shows you can do things in government we've never done before. So I was proud that I could get women and minority-owned business contracts up from 500 million to $1.6 billion in 1 year with no existing program. I was proud that I could get every single resident in Queensbridge houses free broadband paid by the government, something the government never done before. But I also saw how it failed. And unfortunately, it is being beholden to politics rather than people. And that's why I'm running as someone who's never run for public office, because I come from a community, not a political machine. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much. Now turning to policing, I'm going to start with Ms. Garcia once again. Ms. Garcia, there are some proponents that believe that broken windows policing is actually effective and that we should not ignore public intoxication, graffiti, vagrancy, fare evasion, and things of that sort, because these low-level crimes act as a gateway to more violent crimes. Do you agree with that stance? Why or why not?
Thank you for the question. This is really top of mind for most New Yorkers, is how do we create a guardian culture with NYPD rather than an enforcement culture that can translate into harassment for many people of color. Black Lives Matter. My brother is Black. Matthew's life matters, though he did tell me this morning I had to up my shoe game. But we know that PD can be different. We know that it can be a place where no matter what the color of your skin, that you are treated with respect. This takes management, though. I am the only person who is a uniform manager and understands how, a paramilitary organization effectively gets things done. And I have made some proposals that are really quite direct. We are asking police officers to confront sometimes the most challenging situations. And that means we should have them start at age 25. And then we should require that they live in the city of New York, that they are part of our community, that they police within our community, but they live within our community. I think that's critically important. But we have to hold bad cops rigidly accountable. As sanitation commissioner, if you put a black bag in the back of a garbage truck from a commercial establishment, you got fired. That is something that I think is very important. But we can't allow things like open drug dealing to occur on the streets, which is happening in broad daylight right now. That needs to be something that the police address as part of their mission. But we also have to make it so that they have the support they need when confronting, for example, mental health calls, and embedding medical professionals with them. It's not an either or, it has to be a partnership moving forward. But we need to increase training and change the culture. Changing the culture of large organizations is one of the things that I have successfully done, whether or not I was at your Water and Sewer Authority or at the Department of Sanitation. So that is my approach to policing. We can make it better. We can ensure that we are moving to a guardian philosophy from a warrior philosophy.
Thank you.
And I'm going to have to step away because I actually have a shockingly in-person event I have to be at, where I'm wearing 18 layers of clothing to make sure that I don't fly away, so to speak. But it's been a pleasure being with you, Sean and Barry and Louise. I really appreciate the time to chat with you, and look forward to seeing everyone hopefully someday in person and not in little boxes on Zoom. So have a lovely afternoon. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Garcia. Turning now to Ms. McGuire. Ms. McGuire, you have told as recently as a few days ago on January 4th to the Jewish Insider that you are someone of a supporter of Black Lives Matter movement. You are not in favor of defunding the police. If you're elected mayor, how will you work to restore the trust that the public has in New York City Police Department? I believe you're on mute again.
Thank you for that. This is straightforward. We need better police with accountability, not fewer police. It's also personal to me. I could be George Floyd, or I could be Tamir Rice, or Eric Garner. And so it's personal. And so what I would first do is to change the culture of the police department to what I call RAP. It should be respectful, accountable, and proportionate. Respectful, accountable, and proportionate. Police should apply the minimum use of force. It has been said that if the only thing that you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. In the Black and brown communities, it is often a sledgehammer, the result of which are all too well known. And so you need to restore you need to instill a culture into the police department. We also need to make certain that we invest in the mental health professionals so they can be the co-responders. We all know that 4 out of 10 calls that go into the police have to do with mental health issues. And so we need to make certain that we invest in those mental health professionals. We also need to return to community policing, where that relationship that existed for a long while between the community and those people who were sworn to protect the community, that was a relationship of trust, not a relationship of divisiveness, which is what we now have. Remember, under Dave Deakins, it was safe cities, safe streets. And so we need to return to that. We need to invest in the community organizations, the violence interrupters. And once we have done that, restored community police, began to change the dialogue of the community with the police and the community, and to instill the right culture into the police department, then what we have seen, the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that we saw of a cold-blooded murder and what we saw with Eric Garner, those conditions should not exist. And oh, by the way, all that George Floyd and COVID have unveiled are conditions that existed in our communities long before they became so visible. So we need to go in and we need to reform the police department. Better policing, not fewer police.
Thank you. Turning to Ms. Wiley. Ms. Wiley, you served as former chair of the CCRB, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, the body that weighs claims of misconduct against NYPD officers. Currently, claims of misconduct against police officers cannot be substantiated without a witness. Oftentimes, witnesses are afraid to come forward for fear of retaliation and harassment by those officers. As a public defender in the city, I can attest to many clients' fear of coming forward. What can be done to rectify this issue so we're able to hold police officers accountable and restore trust in law enforcement?
So let me just start by saying you're absolutely right. One of the things that I did as chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board was actually build into our public outreach office, create a senior position within the agency on public education and outreach in order to try to figure out exactly that problem, how we could make sure people both understood how they could bring us complaints, but also how to understand their fears about them and have deeper relationships with community. But let me go back to the previous question, because a big part of this is there isn't sufficient civilian oversight at the front end of policing on the policies and priorities of policing. Because while I completely agree with folks that we have to change the culture of policing, it is simply not enough to create a new acronym for it. Because unless the mayor of the city of New York, which is the mayor that I will be, will say, you police department do not tell the public what the rules of the road are for your policing. And you don't tell the public what the priorities are for policing, because they have so much power right now to say, actually, we think we were respectful. And we think you were wrong in telling us we weren't. Actually, we think we are okay harassing kids on a street corner because their overcrowded homes aren't the place they can stay in and talk. It's the bodega on the corner. And yeah, we're going to say that we think we saw you pass some drugs when all you did was pass a pack of gum. That is actually not putting the public back in public safety. So what I would do on the front end is ensure that there are fewer complaints on the back end by making sure that the public, starting with me as mayor, is saying, we're going to be very clear about what you can and cannot do, what excessive force means. And the level of discretion is going to be much more black and white and not so gray. But the second is to say it's problem-oriented policing, that it's not just enough to say culture shift. It has to say that you're not going to be asked to do jobs that we should send mental health professionals do. You're not going to be asked to go into schools. You're actually going to be asked to go after illegal guns that are coming into our community, focus on the priorities of policing, not on criminalizing poverty, and not on the first line when what we need is mental health support and substance abuse support. That's what I will do.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chang, when it comes to policing, you said we don't need more militarized police, especially given that 96% of police calls are nonviolent, and we must reduce the amount of surveillance they do. If elected, what policies would you propose to demilitarize the police and reduce surveillance?
Well, let's actually first talk about what the purpose of policing is. Is it to actually focus only on crimes, or is it actually to ensure public safety? And like Maya, I would say that the role of the police is to ensure safety. And if so, does more police equal more safety? We have to look at the entire life cycle of the criminal justice system, starting off with healthy communities, and then looking at the entire process of criminal justice and how it happens, all the way through to incarceration and then the return back into the communities. So when we talk about data and what we would do, the first place I would start is call for is to use CompStat, not as an indicator of communities who are potentially problematic from a policing perspective, but to use it as a way to identify communities in crisis and be able to think about the intensive focus of supports and services to those communities to provide equity. The second thing we'd have to do is look at how many police do we actually need? Right now, we are in the top 4 in the country in terms of numbers of police per population. Do we actually need them? When you look at the number of police, but to the number of violent crimes, even with the uptick in shootings, we are an outlier in terms of the number of police in the country. So the question then becomes, what should the police actually do? Do we actually need armed intervention for every single type of crisis? Or do we do something like Oakland, where we actually say, okay, we train our operators to understand, distinguish between a situation that requires armed intervention versus one that actually needs a rapid response team comprised of violence interrupters, mental health professionals, and social workers. And then we need to equip those teams to be 24/7, 365, just like the police. I believe if we can do that, and then we can really bring down the stress in the city and make it a much more peaceful coexistence between the police and our communities. The CCRB needs proper funding and it needs more powers. We need to think differently about restorative justice as other alternatives to incarceration. And then for people who are in prison, who are paying their dues, we need to think about ways to lessen the trauma and enable them to have a return back to a productive role in society.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Mr. Cullen. Another thing that's said on your campaign website is that you discuss a campaign philosophy which includes a tribute to heroes. Police officers are often seen as heroes, but to some they are also seen, and rightfully so, as bullies, villains, and sometimes even criminals. If elected, what policies would you push for to ensure that all New Yorkers can look at police officers as heroes instead of as oppressors?
Okay, so let me give a little bit of historical context again. When everything started happening over the summer, it really hit really hard. But I went back to the last pandemic. So let's go back to 1918 with the 97th mayor, Jimmy Walker. He was an assemblyman at the time. At the time, Jimmy Walker introduced a law that legalized boxing. As a feature, he saw that we needed to come up with a whole new set of circumstances for people to engage within boxing. So referees, ring doctors, matchmakers, managers. The Walker Law became the template for boxing nationwide. So in this perspective, I would come up with a modern day Walker Law to engage the community and the police. So a 6-month, 100% complete transparent collaboration among community and police across the 5 boroughs. So police, community, incarcerated judges, and more, we would have that 6-month modern day Walker plan. I would not support the cutting of NYPD funding for one simple reason: terrorism. I don't know if anyone was there in 9/11, But I had friends jump off burning buildings. I had friends trapped on floors, and they faced some of the worst circumstances that no human should ever experience. If we defund the police, and God forbid that ever happened again, then no one would be able to help. So think about if you were trapped in a building. We don't want that to happen. New York City is a target of terrorism. It is a different location. I understand the empathy right now. So in terms of empathy, what I would say is, let's create an engagement, a 10,000 square foot virtual reality lab to simulate experiences in the community so officers feel like what it's to be in the community. One thing we also don't talk about is the NYPD, I think, is awesome in terms of what they do in terms of diversity in the workforce. 47% of the NYPD are white, 53% are members of minority groups. So I think they do a good job there. And one other thing, I think we put in police in political positions at this point. That's not fair. They're not politicians. They are law and they're officers, right? I understand the concerns right now. So what I think we need to do is we just need to come up with new programs, work with all the people. Commissioner Shea has been in the NYPD for 30 years and we put him in political positions. That's not his job. His job is to serve and protect. So for me, what I want to do is just bring everyone together. Let's just solve the problem. Systemic racism is real. I acknowledge that. I also acknowledge that I'm white. I get it. So from that perspective, what we need to do is just solve the problem. Let's sit down, let's solve it, and let's go after it. So no, I would not punish officers. No, I would not punish the community. We need to just solve the problem. So in my eyes, homelessness and all these issues that we're dealing with, there's some bright people in this city. So let's get a whiteboard out. Let's get some markers and let's solve it. Come on. So in retrospect, let me hear what my final thoughts are. One, we're going to have law and order. There's going to be law and order in the city. It's New York City. We're not in some small town outside of America. There's 8.5 million residents, and we need to make sure we have law and order. But there's going to be accountability. If you mess with somebody in the community, you're going to be held accountable, period. And that is what we need in the city right now. Police officers are heroes. Think about 9/11. One last story I want to share before I finish up here, for 20 seconds is read about a story named Wells Remy Crowther. Wells Remy Crowther was a 24-year-old equities trader in 9/11, and he ran up a burning building to save 10 people, and he lost his life that day. He's the only person to ever be an honorary firefighter. So when I say tribute to heroes, this is the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, and we're going to celebrate those stories of heroes because we forgot. And we're never going to forget. So the NYPD are heroes. I hear the community because systemic racism is real. So let's get a whiteboard out. Let's get some markers and let's solve it.
Thank you. Ms. Morales, to continue on accountability of police officers, you have gone on record as saying that when a police officer violates the public's trust, they will be forced to forfeit any privileges afforded to them by the public, including salaries, pensions, and other benefits. You went on to say that your administration would end abuse and officers will face the same consequences as any other person. Offending officers and their benevolent association will be held financially liable for any restitution owed to victims. This is a very controversial topic among New Yorkers. Why are these steps necessary as opposed to other steps, such as filing a complaint with the Civilian Complaint Review Board if you're elected mayor?
Thanks, John, for the question. And let me just start off by saying that these steps are by no means a silver bullet. And I say that very intentionally. We really have to fundamentally overhaul the way policing happens in New York City. Policing is not equal to public safety. When we think about safe communities, they're not communities that are overrun with police officers. And in fact, we know that communities that have a higher presence of police officers are often the ones that report feeling the most unsafe and actually being the most harmed by policing. So I think that's, yes, there are things that we need to do to address police officers that dramatically violate safety and law. However, I think we actually need to address the policing issue at the root. And part of that involves recognizing and educating our communities about the origins of policing and the fact that police actually are drawn from and evolved from slave patrols. And the primary purpose of slave patrols was not, in fact, to keep everyone safe. It was, in fact, to protect the slave owner's property. And Black people at that point in time were considered property. And so we really have to, I believe, move away from this idea of tinkering around the edges with this structure that is fundamentally rooted in racism and white supremacy and move towards systems that will actually create safety for our communities. And to take that back to the first statement that I made about what people envision when they envision safety, it is actually communities that are rich in resources, supports, and services that offer alternatives to their young people, that have mental health services, where people are housed, where people are able to provide for their families. And, you know, to the point of someone else mentioned earlier, actually, I think it might have been you, that 96% of the cases that police respond to are in fact not criminal cases. And so we need to create what I've called for the Community First Responders Department that would be staffed with folks who are trained and skilled in intervening, de-escalating, and connecting people to the services that we need. Defund the police does not mean the same thing as eliminating them. We're not talking about flipping a switch from one day to the other, but we are talking about the need for us to fundamentally transform the definition of public safety and providing safety to low-income Black and Brown communities that they deserve.
Thank you very much. Mr. Foldenauer, oftentimes when there are instances of police misconduct, it is dealt with internally by the NYPD themselves. My question to you is very straightforward. Should cases of police misconduct be tried in criminal court?
Thank you very much for the question, Sean. And as an attorney myself, it's certainly important to me. We certainly need more accountability as to any use of force that's employed by any officer in our city. We ask our police to protect and to serve, and thus there must be accountability. And in those serious instances, when there is misconduct or an improper use of force, then there should be public accountability. You know, if you look at how many police, if you ask yourself how many police officers, how many bad police officers has been discharged in recent years, I can only think of one, and that was the one connected with the Eric Garner, the sad events of Eric Garner. So we do need more accountability of our police. And one big problem with our police right now is that they look at themselves as a police force and not a police service. In basic training, police officers receive over 60 hours of firearms training, but they receive only 8 hours of training in conflict management. That needs to change. In fact, 95% of police officers never even have to discharge their firearm during their entire career. So the biggest problem with the police is that they have a militarized mentality right now. In fact, one of the most outrageous things that Mayor Bloomberg ever said was he said, hey, the NYPD is my army and the 7th biggest army in the world. And he thought it was a funny statement, but in fact, it was not. We need a police service, not a force. And what happened under the Giuliani administration was that Mayor Giuliani redesigned the police uniforms to make them look more intimidating. And that was wrong. So one of my proposals is to redesign the police uniforms so that they look more friendly and more approachable. I would also reduce waste in the system. I live in Lower Manhattan, and I routinely see car upon car of police officer, and they're simply sitting in their cars, looking at their phones while the cars are idling. It's a waste of resources. We need to get our police out of their cars and connect them with the community. And that will go a long way towards building trust with our police. I appreciate the question, Sean.
Thank you very much. Mr. Donovan, what are your thoughts on removing police from schools, and from all mental health responses, homeless outreach, and other social service areas that the NYPD has expanded to in recent years?
Sean, first, let me just compliment you on all the homework you've done for these questions. I've never been at one of these forums where somebody had actually read all our websites, looked at our policies, and so thank you for being so prepared for this. Specifically to your question, you've hit on one of the 3 key frameworks for my criminal justice platform. We need to reimagine policing, and we've heard a lot from Maya and others about ways that we can do that. We need to reduce what we're asking the police to do, and this goes exactly to your question. But then we also have to reinvest what we are spending today on a criminal system and invest it in a system of justice. And I want to come back and talk about that in a moment. Specifically on your question about reducing, you are absolutely right. And in fact, this week, I put out an almost 10,000 word education platform that called very specifically for removing the police from our schools. We need to reduce what we're asking the police to do to get them out of situations where they end up in conflict with our communities, particularly Black and brown communities, at the same time that we're creating real accountability and transparency. So I would absolutely get the police out of our schools. Having worked on homelessness my entire career, I know that homelessness is not a criminal act, and we can't be criminalizing homelessness in our city. What we need is an alternative 911 service staffed with those with real mental health training. My sister was a psychiatrist who worked on a street team in New York and with the homeless in supportive housing. I've seen this firsthand. I've been in homeless shelters, I've walked the streets, and I know that this is not a criminal act to be forced to sleep on the streets. And so we should not have the police picking up the homeless. We should have street teams and alternative 911 systems that allow us to make sure we're doing it. And we can go farther than that too. I was up at an open street, one of the streets that's been closed off to give kids and families more room to walk and play and to be outdoors in the midst of this pandemic. I found out that 75% of our open streets are the responsibility of police to oversee, when we know that they work better when community organizations program them, make sure that people are using them. So we should get the police out of situations, out of work that is putting them directly in conflict and victimizing our kids and our homeless. And we should focus them on guns and violent crime, the things that New Yorkers demand. And I want to say, this isn't just theory to me, just rhetoric, it's reality. I haven't just talked the talk on this, but I've walked the walk. I was part of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force. I led the charge to remove the exception that allowed police departments around this country to get surplus military equipment for free. Think about that. Surplus military equipment was going to our police officers around this country for free. Talk about militarizing the police response. I ended that practice, and I worked with mayors. I'm unique in this race because I've worked with mayors and police chiefs around this country to implement many of the things that we're talking about. But the last thing I want to say is we need to not just reduce what we're asking the police to do and reimagine policing, we need to reinvest. Right now, we're spending almost $600,000 per prisoner per year at Rikers and getting bad results when we know that programs like Neon and so many others work. When I was housing commissioner, under much criticism, I took our housing vouchers, gave them to folks coming out of Rikers, and the results were dramatic. 95% of them after a year were stably housed, getting back to work, and hadn't reoffended. Think about what we can do if we take that $600,000 per year per prisoner and invest it in our communities. We could break the cycle of incarceration and really treat crime as the public health issue that it is, not as just a criminal act.
Thank you very much for that. Councilman Menchaca, kind of got to go off script here and ask a little bit of a different question I initially had for you here.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about police misconduct, and we're all aware that the district attorney's office is responsible for prosecuting any kind of claims of misconduct. But essentially, they'd be biting the hand that feeds them because they also work in hand with them. The police officers do the investigations for the district attorney's office. My question to you is, if elected mayor, would you be pushing for an independent agency to review all cases of police misconduct? Why or why not?
Well, I think you've exposed the nature of our justice system, and I think you're right. I think that you're exposing an opportunity for us to create larger accountability systems. I think there's an ability for the mayor to get involved immediately after misconduct has been reviewed. Sometimes misconduct can be quickly understood. And what we have seen is that the failure of this administration has been slow to act. Pantaleo is just one example of many, but I think there's also a sense of transparency to this issue. So yeah, I think I would be very much in support of that, and I'd work with the advocates to figure out how we build something that can expose. I think what's really interesting about your question, though, is that it builds this sense of police who are right now not being trained to do the things that we want them to do. And part of that is this larger conversation about removing police from the things that other trained clinicians in mental health can be doing. That's going to remove this moment where I think a lot of officers find themselves in a situation that they're just not prepared for. And I think this is where you see a lot of bad acting. And so that's important. But I think in this larger conversation, there are a lot of missed opportunities here to talk about the situation that we're in right now, which is we're in a budget deficit, which means that we're going to be making some very hard decisions in 6 months, not just for this election, but for the budget itself that the council will be passing. And if it's going to be anything similar to last year, we're going to fail yet again with this opportunity to actually invest in the places that we need to. So whether it's a new agency that brings more accountability or decreasing what is an incredibly non-transparent budget. And as someone who's in the budget negotiation team right now in the city council, where we've negotiated 7 years, where I've negotiated 7 years of budget, that needs to be made more transparent. And so I want this club to really work with us in the city council to push us to make changes now. Not only are we going to elect a new mayor in June for the Democratic Party, we need to pass a budget that's just.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to stick with you, Ms. Councilman Menchaca. We're going to switch now to, oh, excuse me. I spoke too soon. We are now joined by City Comptroller Scott Stringer. Mr. Stringer, I'm going to allow you a few minutes here, 3 minutes, to give a brief opening remark.
Well, I want to start out by just thanking the West Harlem Progressive Democrats. I'm excited to be here with my colleagues to exchange ideas about how we bring our city back to life post-pandemic. Maybe for me, the best place to start is to just talk about where we were as a city pre-pandemic. The unemployment rate in February was 3.4%. And the challenges of our city, we had added close to 970,000 jobs over the previous 10 years. When COVID hit, we went from a 3.4% unemployment rate to a rate of 20%. For communities of color, it was much higher. And we literally lost 900,000 jobs in 30 days. And so the challenge for this city is how we bring back this economy. And I would say that we can't bring the economy back the same way we closed it. I know, because I lost my mom to COVID in a Bronx hospital, that the people impacted the most were some of the most economically challenged communities. People in the Bronx and people in Brooklyn, people who never had a fighting chance to deal with issues of type 2 diabetes or obesity because government did not invest in our neighborhoods. And so I want to be the mayor who is able to bring the city back differently and to do the kind of economic and social justice investments that could change our city and put us on the trajectory that we need. And in this campaign, I'm doing my best to put forward the ideas that will let voters know exactly where I stand. I have a real plan to build the kind of low-income housing we need, not relying on revenue developers, by relying on community-based organizations to take advantage of our vacant land, to create a land bank and a land trust, and also to rewrite the zoning rules so that we do create integrated communities, both at the school level and in our neighborhoods. I also want to make sure that we can upskill our workforce. A lot of the jobs that existed in the city pre-pandemic are not going to be here. So I want to partner with CUNY and create a real jobs plan and a skill plan to make sure our kids and our younger people are going to be ready for the jobs of tomorrow. I want to invest very much in all of our communities that relates to health and climate change. We need a 520-mile plan to build out our city, because climate change is not going to be a once in 25 or 50-year episodic event, but unfortunately, climate is literally going to be at our streetscape in a matter of years. And I hope to be able to talk about that. Like many of our candidates, I also want to see a new direction for the NYPD. The challenges that we saw with the attack on protesters who just wanted to raise their voices for reforming policing, we have to double down and create a police force that's going to respect all communities. And I also want to play a role in that. So I'm running for mayor as a kid who grew up in Washington Heights. I've known many of you for a very long time. I believe that better days are coming. I believe we have real opportunity. And I think that even though our democracy was literally challenged this week in Washington, the great thing about this mayoral race and the race for controller and for borough presidents is we're all going to be able to share our ideas to create our view of what the city will be like and look like. And I look forward to working with all of you in the Democratic Club on these issues. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's a busy day today, so I can't stay on because, like many of my colleagues, we're all doing our low dollar fundraising today. So I'm zooming around the city $25 at a time. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much. And before we finish out the topic of policing, Mr. Stringer, I'm going to turn to you to answer a question on policing. You just touched upon the fact that this past summer we saw a lot of clashes between protesters, some of who I represented in court, as well as police. And we saw a huge call for defund the police. And on the other hand, we saw a rise in violent crimes in the city, so a call for more policing. If elected mayor, how do you restore the public trust in police and make sure that we have a working relationship between the community and the police that serve that community? You have 3 minutes.
But the mayor lost control of this police department a long time ago. And that's why you see slowdowns and the kind of policing that just reminds me of an era that I don't even remember. And I've lived in this city all my life. I think we need a mayor who's going to appoint a police commissioner that shares his or her values and commitment to police reform. But I'm also the first to tell you that, I grew up uptown in the 1970s. I remember when there were 2,000 murders a year. I remember my mom saying to me, whatever you do, get on that subway car and find the conductor car. So you had 100 kids sitting with the conductor. I'm happy to say that most kids don't even know there is a conductor on the train. And that was a different era. So I don't want to go back to those days, but I also know that in the name of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner and the people who have lost their lives because of police abuse, that must change. And we need to discipline the bad actors who have foisted real division of policing in our communities. I have a plan that would allow the CCRB to do the punishment or hold the police accountable. I don't think the police commissioner can be in that role anymore. I think the mayor has to put forth a disciplinary agenda, but also we also have to think differently about policing. 40% of 911 calls are not for crimes in progress. They're for issues related to mental health or car alarms, or, we all think 311 handles those calls. It's not true. 911 handles those calls and sends out police to do this work. Well, that's a waste of money. That's a waste of time. And we should reimagine how we respond to those calls to keep the police out of neighborhoods because they're not necessary to be there. There's a wonderful program in Oregon where they let mental health professionals respond to mental health calls, not the police. Out of those 24,000 calls, 150 required police intervention. So these are the kind of areas I think we can improve. I will be coming out with a more expansive criminal justice proposal in the next few weeks, but I do want people to get a sense of where I'm coming from.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to education, and I'm going to start with those that kind of waited patiently on the first two questions to start out, and we'll work our way back to the beginning. So, Mr. Stringer, starting with you again. In terms of education, do you support mayoral control of city schools? If so, why? If not, what alternative do you propose?
I do support mayoral control. I don't want to go back to the days of school boards and no accountability, but I don't support this mayoral control. This administration has created a bureaucracy the likes we've never seen. I've identified $600 million in wasteful spending at the DOE on bureaucrats and not investing in kids in the classrooms. As a public school parent, I see the disparity in education where depending on zip code or a parent's ability to pay determines the education of your child. And I'm the first to tell you that I'm a public school parent, but I got a whole lot of privilege and I'm able to make up the difference as a failed remote learning parent. But I know I can get the extra remote device for my kid or the help that they will need if they're not successful during the pandemic. And I want every parent to have that opportunity. But right now, we've got 100,000 kids in homeless shelters. They're not learning on remote. They don't have the devices they need or the internet service. And that is the disgrace. We need an education system going forward that's going to recognize that a lot of these kids lost their parents and grandparents to COVID because they were frontline workers and they're not getting the resources. So the kids who are already falling behind are the ones that we're going to have to watch out for. And as a parent, I know that everyone feels that their kids are the most precious in the world, and parents will do everything they can for their kids. But what do you do with parents who love their children but don't have money in the bank because we didn't give them the stimulus money or the resources they need and they lost their jobs? And education has got to be about every single child in the system. And while I believe that we need a mayor who understands the budgets of the DOE, because I've audited the hell out of that agency, I know where the wasteful spending is. I know how the bureaucracy has kept so many kids of color down. And I do want to have control of this situation as mayor. I don't want to have a lack of accountability because we're going to have to double down in the next 4 years.
Thank you. Turning to Councilman Menchaca. Would you support decentralizing the Board of Education and having each borough have its own Board of Education?
This is a very popular idea that is growing right now. And I think a lot of that has come through the response to COVID and a lot of the autonomy that some of our districts, and I represent a district in Sunset Park, and that includes Sunset Park and Red Hook, District 15, that has an incredible dichotomy of experience, Park Slope, white, wealthy families and immigrant families in Sunset Park. So I think that this is something that we should consider, partly because the responses to COVID have really differed based on infrastructure. And what that allows us to do is actually allow for a little bit more of a rapid response to the things in crisis that we're in right now. So I would very much consider that and really look to parents, students, staff, principals to really inform this. I do also agree that this current mayor's approach has been a very highly bureaucratic expansion, and so we need to really rethink how we fund our schools and build more opportunities for schools to have the funding that they need at the teacher level. I think we need to pay teachers more. I know that's not part of your question, but to your grander point, I think that this is a massive system, and the system has to be able to respond directly to the need of a school in a borough, in a district that is different, and so I think there's ways to do that.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Mr. Donovan. Very simple question. What is your position on charter schools?
I'm for good schools. And I believe that we can have good charter schools. I've seen it. I've worked with mayors across the country that have helped to create good charter schools. But I also know that for too long, charter schools have been held to a different standard, and that we've seen too many abuses of the kind of enforcement and discipline and other steps that screen out too many kids of color and ensure that we're not getting the kind of success and closing the racial disparities that we see in our education system. And so I would create much more consistency and accountability around charters and make sure that we are holding everyone accountable to the same standards. I will also go back to the point that I made earlier, that this past week, I released an almost 10,000 word education policy called A Million Strong. And I want to really focus on the fact that while the charter school issue is an important one, the most critical issues we're facing right now are recovering from COVID and closing the gaps that have widened. That's why I proposed an education recovery corps that would put to work our fantastic CUNY students and others, create new jobs, and really deal with both the learning gaps, but also the social and emotional needs of students who've experienced trauma this past year with COVID, the loss of their loved ones, the loss of their friends, and a sense of community in their schools. It's why I really prioritized creating a cradle to career pipeline in our schools, guaranteeing every single high school student in this city at least one paid internship while they're a high school student, and creating a real connection to CUNY, and then into the most aggressive apprenticeships program, working with unions and many others in this country, and demanding in my first 100 days that the CEOs of the largest companies in New York make an equity corporate commitment that they would hire students, no matter their color, no matter where they come from, out of our public school system and out of CUNY here. And then finally, I have an aggressive effort that would ensure that we create more equity in our school system. We need to go beyond just getting rid of middle school screens and other steps that the mayor's taken to create more diversity and integration in our neighborhoods, and also to make sure that our teachers reflect the city. We have 42% teachers of color in a school system that's 85% kids of color. That has to change. CUNY is one of the jewels of the public education system in this country, and we can work with CUNY to make sure that we build the most diverse and most talented teacher corps in this country, and that's what I would do as mayor.
Thank you very much. Turning to Mr. Foldenauer. It is my understanding that both of your parents were elementary school teachers in public schools. Given the current state of affairs with our education system, what concrete changes would you make to our public school system?
Thank you, Sean. Yes, both of my parents were public school teachers. In fact, that's how they met. And so education is very important to me. One important issue in our school system is that we bring racial equity to the system. I was lucky to be raised in public schools. And in fact, I attended a very diverse public school myself. And one problem we have in our school system is that if you look at studies, during the school year, minority children keep up with non-minority children very nicely. But then when you hit the summer break, there is a learning loss because, of course, wealthy parents are able to send their kids to summer school, make sure they read, and make sure they continue to grow their skills. On the other hand, if you have a single mom in NYCHA, is less able to ensure that their child keeps learning during the summer. So therefore, one of my marquee proposals for the school system is to have a longer school year so that both minorities and non-minorities are on the same level playing field. In New York, students attend school for only 180 school days. If you look at more competitive countries, children attend school for 192 days in Britain, 204 days in Italy, and 260 days in China. So if we implement a longer school year here in New York City, then minorities will be better able to keep up. I'm also committed to reopening our schools as much as possible. Of course, we've all been decimated by the pandemic, but I do think it's important to keep the focus on reopening our schools because, again, it's the same issue as I mentioned earlier. Wealthy parents are able to ensure they continue to homeschool their kids, whereas single moms, single dads are not able to do that. So I am committed to opening our schools. I also think, number three, we need more vocational education in our schools. Not every child is going to be able to go to college. And thus, I think we need to teach children skills that they actually need. And what I would do as mayor is partner with the business community and understand the skills that they want out of our students. And then in turn, make sure that our schools are teaching our children those specific skills. And lastly, I'm not sure where I am on my time, Sean, but I do
10
believe,
seconds.
okay, I do believe we should empower our school teachers. There's too much teaching to the test, and that must change.
Thank you very much. Ms. Morales, you said when it comes to education, we must change what we teach and how we teach. My question to you is, how should we teach our kids and what should we teach them?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, one of the things I talk about and when I talk about education is that if you look at our classrooms, they actually don't look radically different from the classrooms in Little House on the Prairie. Our students are sitting up, lined up in rows. There's a teacher at the front imparting knowledge. Our children are expected to absorb that knowledge and regurgitate it. That does not prepare our children to participate either in democracy or the economy. So when I talk about changing what we teach and how we teach it, there are three core pillars that I think we need to adopt. Financial literacy, digital and technological literacy, and civic and democratic literacy. There is no subject that we try to teach kids in school that cannot be captured under one of those umbrellas. And we need to do it in such a way that we are incorporating the city as a classroom and getting our children out into the community through partnerships with arts and cultural institutions and businesses and corporations so that they're being exposed to the world around them and also to long-term career opportunities so that they have the ability to make informed decisions about the path that they choose to pursue rather than being funneled into particular pathways that are pre-selected for them. I also talk about the idea of us creating a seamless K through 16 pipeline that incorporates CUNY and incorporates career training and access to different professions along the way, exposure through job shadowing, through internship programs, through fellowship programs that enable them to begin to experience lots of different sectors and lots of different opportunities to learn and to choose. The last thing I'll say on this is that we will, given what we've gone through over the last year, we need to understand how to fully incorporate technology into the classroom. And we also need to understand how we can leverage virtual instruction to begin to desegregate our classrooms. There is no reason why we need to continue to be bound by district or geographic boundaries. There's no reason why the best teacher in Central Brooklyn could not be teaching a class of diverse students from the South Bronx, from Harlem, and from Jamaica, Queens. That is how we can think about beginning to incorporate virtual education into the classroom, instruction into the classroom, while also beginning to desegregate. So those are some of my thoughts about what we need to do moving forward.
Thank you, Ms. Morales. Mr. Cullen, whether to decentralize BOE, Board of Education, or not is going to be your question. Some say yes, some say no. You said that you would support decentralizing the Board of Education in some capacity. In what capacity would you support decentralizing the Board of Education?
100%. So this goes back to the systemic racism issue I think we talked about early on. I really do think the school system was just built on a house of cards, back in 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way until now. Our school system is not going to be able to offer equality to everyone if it wasn't built for everyone. It's just the reality of the situation. If we even look at bias algorithms and we look at tech, right, the training data sets that go into algorithms are wrong. So that's just an example. So what I would do is decentralize it in some sort of way. We have to put modern experiential education opportunities at the forefront of what we do. Education is probably my expertise. I spent a lot of time as a teacher, as a high school teacher, college professor. I founded the Harlem Tech Summit with a CUNY professor. So we need a modern approach to corporate immersion, hands-on experience, group projects with the blended learning methodology. So we got to introduce a repeatable process to solve big challenges. So when I say decentralize, I do think communities are going to know what to do within their community. So let me give you an example. So say there's a small business in Harlem that needs a website that can be built out. Why don't we use a student who's at a local school to actually build that website and make it part of the curriculum that a teacher uses? So we need these tangible opportunities. So I would decentralize it, but don't do it in a way that disrupts the system right away. That's not fair. Let's be thoughtful in how we do that. So it's an answer that we have to go and actually do it and find information and be empathetic about it. So I would introduce actually a public school program. I think to Diane's point, Sean's point, I think experiential education is really important. So I would introduce a pedagogy, curricular framework, and assessment tool. So to fundamentally shift how we do things, we need to train teachers. We never talk about training teachers with the toolkits of the 21st century. So pedagogy, design thinking, corporate immersion, prototyping, projects, and evaluation. I'd introduce a curricular framework for people to integrate certain things in the workforce, right? The one thing we don't talk about is assessment. We need to assess students and follow them through the process of learning. So longitudinally, we've actually lost our ability to create. I believe around 5 or 6 years old, we lose that ability to create, not for anyone's purpose. Think about a paperclip. Most kindergartners can come up with 250 reasons why to use a paperclip. Is it 250 feet and made out of foam? Can you use it as a Christmas ornament? So we lose that ability to create. We need to bring that back to solve some of our traditional problems. So at the core of it, I would use an assessment methodology to place the learner at the center of their curriculum. So my tools, a lot of what I would do is be for teachers. We don't look out for our teachers. Curricular frameworks, pedagogy, and assessment methodologies and tools that can help. So we're going to decentralize with these methodologies, make sure any technology that we built does not have bias to them. I don't know if you guys have been following the story about Timnit Jbrew, but artificial intelligence and algorithm building, it is true. Training data sets are not equal, and that is just the reality. So that's what I would do. I would work with schools to come up with these programs for experiential education. And the best part is that I've already done a lot of this. So I put 5 links into the panelists and attendees box. Look at all the things that I've done over the last 10 years. This is real, this is tangible, and things that I've actually done and completed. So, I'll be down here, 200 Broadway working on things like this. Curriculum, as an example, last thought here is, let's say even to other issues. Why aren't we designing empathy curriculum for the community and the NYPD? Why aren't we building empathy curriculum for homeless? We can use education and integrate it into everything that we do. And that's what we should be doing, because education is the lifeblood of a city. So that's my thoughts. Let's decentralize the board, but do it in a thoughtful way, and have every stakeholder engaged.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chang, you said the real question as it relates to education, we need to ask, what is the purpose of education and how do we define success? So I will ask you, how do we define success?
Every student, I think what every parent wants is for their student to graduate from school, however we define that, with a sense of confidence, to be able to be a self-actualizer and a self-learner, and to be able to navigate the world with all of its changes flexibly and sustainably. And that to me is what success is all about. So when we talk about where we are with education, it is kind of the opposite of that. We kind of breed a lack of confidence. We breed lack of flexibility and lack of sustainability. And so when we think about the purpose of education, we have a one-size-fits-all model, which, as Diane correctly points out, is about 100 years old. It needs to be completely rethought. Why can't we work from the bottoms up? Why can't we deliver personalized education? And why can't we go from infancy all the way through to workforce and beyond? So the things that I really care about are, we're proposing a universal childcare program beginning at age 1, expanding on the universal pre-K4 program that the mayor has implemented. We also believe that technology is a part of education. We have to have universal broadband. We need to be able to provide technology to every single person in New York City, because it is critical to education. It's critical actually to being able to participate in the modern economy. We should think about a digital school. Not every student, especially after what COVID has shown us, is that not every student is going to progress at what we think of as a traditional method for moving from grade to grade to grade to grade to grade. But this problem actually pre-existed COVID. We had families who suffered from housing loss, from food insecurity, from deaths within their families, and we never figured out how to have an educational system that could adapt. Why not have a digital school where every student can knows that their guidance counselor, their faculty, and their colleagues, their fellow students, are the same regardless of where they live. And then finally, I think that I totally agree with again, Diane, that there needs to be a much more seamless transition from high school to CUNY. We have CUNY, which is one of the greatest assets in this country, which should be leveraged far more than it is, should be invested in much more than it is. So if you're taking an advanced course in high school, why can't you take that at CUNY? Why can't that be delivered digitally? Why can't you get credit for that? Why isn't there workforce development starting when you're in high school, when you're beginning to think about your roadmap into adulthood? Why aren't we teaching kids some of the fundamental things that they need to know? And yes, technology is a part of that. So what this amounts to is actually thinking about prioritizing equity over anything else. New York City is the greatest city in the country, one of the great cities of the world. It deserves to have the greatest school system in the world that delivers education with equity, which thinks about it completely differently. And so the facets of education I think are super important are 4 things. Number 1, every student should know how to be a productive and vital participant of their civic society, including knowing what their rights are. Number 2, every student should be able to engage with the economy in a flexible way that can adapt to the future of work, and the future of education, by the way, needs to adapt along with it. The third thing is every student should know how to take care of their family. How do you know how to balance a budget, to cook, to do minor repairs, to actually work with your hands, to make things, to be able to take care of somebody else, to treat other people with respect, to know what it means like to have children and raise them. And the fourth one, which we always forget, is taking care of yourself. Every person should know how to take care of themselves from a nutrition perspective, mental health perspective, and other things that are vital to being able to becoming a productive member of our society.
Thank you. Ms. Wiley, you are co-chair of Mayor de Blasio's School Diversity Advisory Group, and you co-led a process with 40 plus stakeholders that included parents, students, leaders, advocates, academics to present a series of proposals, including integration goals to tackle the structural inequalities and racism that exist in our school system. Which of those proposals or what proposals do you think should be enacted to tackle the issues that are currently facing our public schools?
Thank you. And let me say, as someone who spent 30 years of my career on racial justice and equity as a civil rights attorney, working on multiple issues, I was grateful for the opportunity to co-lead that process with Hazel Dukes, with Jose Calderon, and to have a group of 42 people who represented everything from parents to students, including some students that were in middle school, not just high school students, teachers, principals. We had the teachers unions at the table. I say that because these are questions that are central, not just to who we are as a city, but to what future our kids have and whether our kids have a future that is one that is cohesive. It is one that recognizes that we are one people, we are one city. So I will say that I stand behind the recommendations that was part of a group process that I was privileged to watch unfold and to co-lead in a way that was truly participatory. And I'll also say this, it is about having high expectations for every single one of our kids. So when I think about, Sean, that question you asked Art, and all the important ideas that we've heard from every single person today, that it starts with every single kid. And every single kid deserves to be seen as exceptional. And we don't have a system that sees our kids that way. And unfortunately, that system also suggests that something's wrong with some of our kids, that some of our kids cannot be successful. And that's wrong. But we also have a pandemic in which we have both seen that 73% of those who have died and far too many of the kids who have not been able to get online and to get online learning effectively are kids of color, are the kids that were not getting sufficient investments in the schools before COVID. But here's the thing, we also now have to catch our kids up, because the reality is that they have lost educational time. And that while I agree with so much of what's been said about the opportunities for learning online, I'll also say that nothing replaces the kinds of opportunities the kids get learning together. And they've lost that for this year. And we have to couple that with a recognition that we have now blown open, as a result of this crisis, the opportunity to do so many things differently, including how we think about having a high level of educational expectation from every kid. And I'm a kid that as a kid was in a segregated public school that was overcrowded and underfunded. And I'll tell you right now that what we have the opportunity to do with our vacancy rates is also recreate physical in-person learning that is integrated, in addition to some of the things we've already, that Art and that Diane have already said about how we can use technology differently. And we also have to acknowledge that it is kids of color who do less well, even with technology online, because we have not figured out how to do online learning effectively for any kid, if we're honest, let alone for kids of color. And so I say all that because it also includes resourcing sufficiently our teachers and our administrators. We had some coming up with some incredibly creative ways of trying to make sure they were serving their students during this crisis, but they weren't doing it with a lot of support. And by and large, it was those principals and those teachers in underfunded, overcrowded, segregated schools that weren't getting it. So a big part of what we have to do is not just assume that everything we thought before COVID was the best way to do it. It's that we have to be open to a process that puts people first and says that we have to look at the innovations that have happened. We have to see the opportunities out of our crisis and challenge, and we have to call our people together to discuss them and to figure it out together, including being willing to let go of our ideas from the past because they're new opportunities. And so we in this campaign are having people's assemblies in order to have those discussions, to invite New Yorkers. And you do not have to support me as a candidate to participate. It is my great privilege to listen and learn. And that is how I will lead in this crisis. Listen, learn, and lead in partnership. And with that, I'll say we will have more coming out, but we do hope you go to MayaWileyForMayor.com and sign up and participate in a People's Assembly, because that school diversity advancement group process that we had was fundamentally about doing that. And we need to continue to do that as a city, to come together and do more than recover, to reimagine. And I apologize that I'm going to have to jump because this has been a critically important forum. I want to thank you, Sean, for having me. And I want to thank every single participant because I learned from all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley. I appreciate it. Mr. McGuire,
Yes.
I'm going to continue with education. I know that's been one of your key issues. In fact, you've gone on the record to say that one way the U.S. can begin to address racial inequality is through the education system. You said, quote, growing up on the other side of the tracks in Dayton, Ohio, the opportunity to be bused to the suburbs beginning in middle school helped make his way, or make your way, for the more than 30-year Wall Street career possible. What do you see the mayor's role in addressing segregation in New York City schools and ensuring there is equity and inclusion for every child, no matter race or zip code?
So, Sean, thank you for this. This is fundamental to who we are, and it's fundamental to whom I am. And you've cited some of the comments that I've made. Education was my way out. My single mother sacrificed so I could get an education. And while I welcome a lot of the experimental ideas, including one that has obviously done the homework to identify my platform of cradle to career, and I go into specifics about that. The situation today, long before George Floyd and COVID, was not working for most Black and brown children. It should not be the case that if you randomly pick 10 Black and brown kids in the 4th grade, that only 2 of them are at level of reading. And so the system needs to be overhauled. And my plan is cradle to career or cradle to job. And what do I mean by that? Pre-K is important, but what we know is that by the time many of our children arrive at pre-K, they're already behind. And so I want to start before pre-K, cradle, 0 to 4. And what we know, what all mothers know, is that while these children are developing, they're learning. And I want to invest in those programs from 0 to 4. And then I want to make certain, for my account, mayoral control, I want to make certain that by the end of the 3rd grade, that every New York child can read. And I want to be held accountable for that. And we should have a New York tutor corps to ensure that, whether it takes place in the classroom, whether it takes place in a NYCHA room, whether it takes place in the libraries, I said on the board of the public libraries, whether it takes place in the churches, that by the end of the 3rd grade, every one of our children can read. Why is that? Because from 0 to 4, our children are learning to read. They're learning to read. And then from 0 to the end of 3rd grade, 0 to the end of 3rd grade, our children are learning to read. After that, they're reading to learn. And if they never learn to read, there's not a system in place that can remediate so that they get there. And then I want to start in the 6th grade to expose our children to different opportunities, meaning they can become an astronomer, they can become a paleontologist, they can become a coder, they can become a programmer. They get exposed to opportunities at the 6th grade. And I also want to make certain that they have summer jobs that expose them to these different opportunities. When I was growing up, part of the education process was to make certain that I had some kind of income like that. I was a day laborer. I dug footers. I laid tile. I changed bedpans. I DC'd IVs. I made boxes in the basement of Phil's dress shop. And so that allowed me to be exposed to a whole lot of different worlds. And I want to make certain that starting at the 6th grade, that we give our children the opportunity so that by the time they graduate, and it is important, it's important to increase the graduation rate, because the crisis to which I referred from the outset has persisted. And the program that people are identifying, the experimental programs, just haven't happened for Black and brown kids. 25% graduation rate, we have to raise that. So by the time these kids get there, that one, the graduation rate increases, and because I've engaged the private sector to have jobs available, they can either do one of 3 things. They can go get a job for which they are prepared, they can go to a 2-year college, or they can go to a 4-year college. What does that do? That gives the entire spectrum of education. And yes, we do need to make certain that we identify what we now have as a COVID generation. And that COVID generation includes many of those children who, but for the New York Public Library branches, wouldn't have access to Wi-Fi. So many of our kids have access to no tablet, no laptop, no Wi-Fi. And part of my central plan vision would be to make certain that we have every child in New York City, including those in the homeless shelters, get access to broadband and get access to tablets and to laptops. And given the relationships that I've been able to develop, and given the vision I have for building infrastructure, which includes access to broadband and the city of the future in technology, those kids will, on my watch, be assured that they get access to world of technology so they can learn the basics. And along the way, in 6th grade included, I want to make sure that they do get financial literacy. Along with that skill set, that they get exposed to that, so they understand the world of how to save and how to balance a checkbook and how to exist in a modern economy in a world of technology. So it's cradle to career. It's cradle to career that starts at 0 and goes to the time these kids either get a job, go to 2-year college or 4-year college. And that's my view. And that's essential to who I am, because but for that education, and but for my mother, who's 94 years old, but for her sacrifices, I wouldn't be here. So this is not a matter of a theory. This is a matter of practice and who I am and how I've gotten here.
Thank you very much. And 94-year-old mother, that's a blessing right there. We're going to turn to our last topic, which is COVID-19 and issues related to that. For this round, I'm going to ask that everybody, for time's sake, to keep their answers or their responses to 2 minutes. So we'll start with you, Mr. McGuire. COVID-19 has hurt communities all across New York, not just physically and emotionally, but financially. There has been almost no aid from the federal government, and our governor has refused to raise revenue needed to provide relief. Ms. Garcia, who was on here earlier, hails herself as the crisis manager. And there is no doubt we are in a crisis. Given your background in finance, what steps would you take in office to secure the funding required to recover from this pandemic and to avoid austerity and cuts to social services?
So we are facing 3 existential crises at once, and probably 4. Number 1 is COVID. the pandemic. Number two is the budget. We have a budget deficit that's material, that has been delayed. By the time this mayor takes office, by the time I take office as the new mayor, we're going to be facing an enormous budget deficit. Also have what you've referenced here, Sean, so appropriately is the injustices that occur as a result of all the discrimination that's taking place, racially and religiously. We have to build our way out of this. We have to build our way out of this. So the plan that I have is going big and going small. Going big, I've referenced, which is creating 500,000 jobs so we can put New York to work. It also includes making certain that we go small and protecting the small businesses, which employ 50+% of the people in New York. We need to cut the red tape. We need to make certain that we invest in those small businesses so that we grow our way out of this. We need to look at this budget in its entirety, including what assistance we can get from the federal government. And I am proud to say that I was one of the ones, or was the one who introduced the vice president-elect to New York City. And so I can imagine that if there's anybody who's well-positioned to go and make the case for New York for federal assistance, which is going to be important, will be vitally important to how we manage this deficit. I'm perfectly prepared in one of the best, if not the best position to go do that. And when it comes to managing budgets, I'm not new to managing budgets. I've been in business for over 40 years. I manage budgets that are larger than most state budgets. And the fact about the budgets that I manage is that if you don't manage those budgets well, you don't continue to be in a leadership role. I've managed, I've led. And in each of those years, a long and standing head of someone in my position in the history of Wall Street. I know how to manage budgets. I managed budgets from the depth of the financial crisis, being able to attract and retain the best people and meet each one of those budgets by growing our way out. So we're going to have to make certain that we are disciplined in how we spend. We're going to have to make certain that we're aggressive and have a vision on how we grow. We need to grow our way out of this. We need to grow our way out of this, and each of us is going to have to contribute. And there's a question that comes up about one line item, and that is taxes. Each of us who has the resources, including myself, will have to pay more, but we cannot tax our way out of this. We need to grow our way out of this. So my vision, going big, going small, does just that. 500,000 jobs to make certain New Yorkers are put back to work, and so that I lead the greatest economic recovery that's inclusive in the history of New York City.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chang, COVID has disproportionately affected communities of color because people of color are disproportionately put into harm's way to put their own health at risk for the good of others, such as to drive buses, staff grocery stores, care for our elderly. In return, they receive low wages and little left over to provide a better life for their kid, who will one day experience the same familiar story unless we break the cycle. These were your words. What preventative care solutions can you implement, if elected, that would break the cycle that we see in so many low resource communities? You have 2 minutes. Oh, sorry. You have to unmute yourself, sorry. There you go.
Thank you. Families of New York City struggled before COVID. You know, we have an average household income of $69,000, but there's no place where the disparity in income actually shines as much as in the city's budget. The recent budget forecasts have been revised upwards because the people who are really affected are the ones who are poor and working. And the people who have money, who pay the property taxes, who have the income taxes, have actually continued paying them. And so the budget deficit is not as bad as people think. But let's look at that budget and what we can do with it. The city's budget today is over $90 billion. When 8 years ago, the city's budget was under $70 billion. It has grown by $20 billion a year. Imagine what you could do with $20 billion. $20 billion is equal to roughly 40,000 units of housing. There's a tremendous amount that can be done. The first thing we have to do right now is actually stop the bleeding. We have to keep people in their houses, keep small businesses in their stores. It's the only way that we're going to be able to have a sustainable rebound. Big business is not going to grow us out of this. Big business has not added jobs in the past 10 years in the city. Growth has come from the small businesses in the city, which make up 98% of all businesses. Yet, given the fact that they employ over 50% of the people of the city, they haven't gotten the same relief that that big business has gotten. It is a complete disparity, and that disparity translates down into these poor communities. And the other piece that I want to say here is that what COVID has shown us is that we have an overly narrow view of public health. It's not just the absence of disease, it is a presence of well-being. What we have right now is a society focused on reactive, punitive measures and a government that actually does that. So to actually realign everything, we have to make a government that is more predictive, more collaborative, focused on the overall well-being of our communities.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cullen, when it comes to COVID, you said you will introduce a fraud authentication technology, much like an Amber Alert on your iPhone to ensure constant communication for services to those who use them the most. You said we need to secure technological communication. You went on to say also that you would work with the FCC to create a communications channel with a two-way Amber Alert for contact tracing. You said we need to provide resources to the underserved first, period. How does this fraud authentication technology ensure that underserved areas and communities of color are served with the necessary resources? You have 2 minutes. You're on mute.
So check out the Google Drive link that I just shared. Hopefully that works if the permissions are on there correctly. So what I think is going on right now is just there's been inefficiencies from the city to the state level, and I'm not going to sit here and just point blame. I just want to get to solving the problem, right? So a fraud authentication technology is actually already on the market. So it's called Boloro. So Boloro is a technology that creates a two-way Amber Alert system, right? So Sean, let's say you have your iPhone, you get an Amber Alert and it says you've been around somebody that has been contact traced with, COVID. You can reply back with your digital number and then be able to go and find out in a more seamless way, the contact tracing methodology. So the reason I say the FCC communication channel, which is why I love the technology, is that it's off the internet. And it also is private. It's private. So people have privacy data concerns at the moment. So we need a full accountability of everybody in the city, because if we don't get a full picture, we're not going to know what's going on. So to push to the next point, because I only have a minute here, a big part of my platform is putting together 50 public-private partnership committees with 2 co-chairs that are equal, and then 1 co-chair in each one of the boroughs. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of inclusive capitalism. We can do good, but we can do well. And we have to be equal in everything that we do. So I can prove right now, data-wise, that Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio have actually lost a lot of lives because they haven't been efficient in the way they've collected data. And you can't make effective decisions unless you have the right data. And to another point, your data is your data. You own it, period. So I can get into a whole rift about that. For COVID, we need practical solutions right now. And that technology, by the way, is free. Free, F-R-E-E, so free. So that means we are looking out for people. We can prove that these technologies work, and that's what we need right now. We have the brightest people on the planet. Why aren't we asking them for solutions? And I think we need the humility. Our politicians need humility. I'm not a politician, as you can probably tell by some of my imperfect answers, but that's okay. I'm human, and we need to bring that back. So humility, but have a little bit of ego. I understand you're in politics, I get it, but have humility, right? And be able to go, look, we got some smart people in the city that have solutions. Let's get, like I said, look at me right now, right? Let's get a whiteboard, let's get some markers and just figure it out. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Ms. Morales, the impact of COVID has hit this city hard. To recover, you said we must also urge wider reform and sign on to the demands for rent cancellation and debt relief paid by New York City's most wealthy and or federal aid. But if we cancel rent, landlords will not get paid. What reforms would your administration enact to take care of the landlords and still ensure that New York City is able to recover? You have 2 minutes.
Sure. So I believe that landlords, small landlords in particular, are also entitled to that kind of relief and support. I'm particularly interested in finding ways that allow and support small homeowners, mom and pops, grandma down the block, in being able to maintain their homes despite the crisis. And I think that the first step that we need to take is to provide relief to renters and small homeowners by canceling the rent and the mortgage. I think it's time for us, one of my campaign is based on the premise of a radical reimagining and transformation of all of the systems that have led to the current inequities and injustice. The need for us to address the structural and systemic challenges at the root. Part of that means holding big corporations and banks. It is time for them to put some skin in the game. It is time for them to bear the brunt and cover the cost. We have seen over the last 10 months what tax relief has done in terms of boosting corporations and the stock market. They have actually benefited on the backs of those who are most marginalized and those who are struggling the most. It is time for them to actually reinvest by helping to address the challenges that our communities and that the people that have made it possible, in fact, for them to profit. The people who have operated this city and made it possible for the city to run, and the people that have taken care of our ill during this period of time, and the people that have made it possible for them to work comfortably from home during this period of time. It is time for those who have benefited on the shoulders of low-income Black and brown marginalized communities to put some skin in the game and help with this relief. And that's where I would go with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Foldenauer. We have seen COVID wreak havoc on communities of color disproportionately. The environment where people live and what kind of food they can access plays a huge role into that. You're an environmental advocate. What would you do if you're elected mayor to make sure that people have access to the resources that they need to live a more healthy lifestyle and fight off these diseases that are ravaging their communities? You have 2 minutes.
Thank you for the question, Sean. I'm the only candidate for mayor that has set forth a comprehensive platform for healthy eating, because I do believe that we missed an opportunity during the pandemic. Our leaders should have told people to use this opportunity to exercise, to use this opportunity to get healthy. And unfortunately, alcohol sales went up 20%, chocolate sales went up 20%, and the first thing to sell out during the pandemic were things like Doritos. So we do need more healthy eating in our city. One of my core ideas of my platform is to ban unhealthy eateries in government-controlled buildings. So if you have a government-controlled building and you're serving unhealthy food there, then the government is then contributing to the obesity crisis, to the health crisis, to uptrends in diabetes diagnoses that we now see in our society. So we must do that. I'm also for promoting healthy eating in our schools. Most schools, most children, the only healthy meal they get is in school. And a lot of our school meals today are unfortunately frozen pizza, frozen fish nuggets that are merely reheated. We actually need to overhaul the food that we serve in our schools and making sure that we serve our kids fresh food. I was lucky. I grew up, as you know, Sean, the son of 2 public school teachers, and we were lucky to be loaned a plot of land where my parents maintained an organic garden. And I went there regularly during the summer with jugs of water to water the corn and beans. And we had fresh fruit, fresh vegetables to eat. And that's what our children deserve here in New York City. And that's what we must do. And I know my time is running out, Sean. Food insecurity is a big issue. On my website, aaronfornyc.com. I encourage all of your listeners to check out my platform on healthy eating.
Thank you very much. Mr. Donovan, very straightforward. What would be your plan towards economic recovery for businesses here in the city? You have 2 minutes.
Thanks, Sean. Let me just start by saying this has been a pandemic that has devastated communities of color. And while I'm shocked, I'm not surprised. I've seen over and over again in my experience with crisis that those who are most vulnerable before a crisis hits are always affected the most profoundly. And that's why our recovery, economic, health, educational, all of our recovery has to prioritize those who have been hit the hardest. And that's true of my economic recovery plan as well. I would ensure, first of all, as the candidate with the deepest experience and relationships in Washington, D.C., where the most important, the most significant aid to help our communities and our businesses recover is going to come from, there is no one better positioned than me to go argue for those resources. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I was on the phone with leaders in Congress in the incoming Biden administration, helping shape the recovery package to make sure New York got the help that it needed. And second of all, this isn't theory to me. This isn't just a platform on my website. When COVID hit, I went to work and banded together with World Central Kitchen, Rethink Food, local community organizations, started an effort called Common Table that got healthy, fresh meals delivered directly to people's doors, but that also got our restaurants cooking. And that program can actually be funded by FEMA aid. I was talking with the incoming Secretary of Homeland Security that oversees FEMA just a few days ago to try to make sure that hundreds of millions of dollars can come to New York City restaurants, put folks back to work, and get people eating again. That's exactly the kind of help that I could bring as mayor to New York City, because I'm uniquely positioned to be a mayor that gets this city working again and helps us not just rebuild and repair our city, but reimagine it as a place that works for everyone.
Thank you very much. And with the final question for today's town hall, and I want to thank everybody, Councilman Menchaca. Councilman, the COVID pandemic, as you heard and know, has negatively impacted communities of color. Yet those communities were among the last to receive testing and other services. If elected, what will you do to ensure that resources are allocated to the communities that need them the most? You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Sean. And I want to thank you all again for hosting this forum. What we know deeply is that communities impacted, like people of color, public housing, immigrants, have been greatly impacted. What we need to do is look at the municipal budget. We are running for mayor of a city of New York. Already we see deficiencies in approaches where agencies are focused on white affluent communities with a lot more fervor and exposure. We need to change that. That's going to require for a mayor to be able to bring in and hone in on these discrepancies and ensure that agencies are fighting. In this whole forum, we talked about housing and lawyers protecting tenants. Right now, there are communities that do not have access to that because the mayor has refused to expand that housing, the council for housing and tenants. Certificate of no harassment, for example, are still not in some communities like mine in Sunset Park. And so there are things that we can do. And so this is an opportunity to plug in that I want all of us as mayoral candidates and Democratic clubs across the city to engage in this budget process. And so what I'm offering to your question is that we fix it now, that we take this leadership and we take this opportunity that we're all going to be exposing our ideas to voters to hone in on the current council to figure it out. We have the power as a council to vote in our own budget. Right now, the mayor in this system proposes an initial budget. We give him ideas and feedback. He comes back with another executive budget, and then we go and negotiate. We can actually circumvent the mayor this time, a lame duck, someone that has not given us leadership, someone I have been fighting since 2014 when I got elected, and bring in a people's budget. This will dramatically address the issues that we are all talking about, but to do it now. And so I'm calling on all the mayors to work with us and build something that works, that begins to funnel new resources to communities that have not gotten them for a long time.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our candidates today. If I'm going to allow everybody a minute to give a brief closing remark. We'll start with Mr. McGuire.
Thank you, Westside Democratic Club, and I look forward to earning your support. You know, I've been contemplating this for a while, and October 15th, I called my 94-year-old mother and I said, "Mama, I'm quitting my job." That may be the most difficult conversation I've had, because the response is, you must have lost your natural born mind. But I explained to my mother that given how I grew up and the sacrifices that she'd made, and given the opportunities I'd been given through education and her sacrifices, I was able to come to New York with education, with no money, and with a lot of debt, and to get an experience and to perform in one of the most competitive fields that exist anywhere, and to perform as a Black man. And I said, with how I grew up and with leadership, proven leadership, and with the managerial skills that I've been able to develop in managing budgets and managing people, and given the relationships that I've been able to develop, Mama, that I was uniquely positioned. I'm like Shirley Chisholm. And she remembered Shirley Chisholm. I said, I'm unbought, unbossed, and unbound. And I said, you know, this is where I met Crystal, my wife, and where we're raised in Colell and Leo. And this city has been good to us, and we love this city. So I can take all of that. I can take my lived experiences. If I can take what I've been able to accomplish in business, and if I can take the relationships that I've been able to develop, and this has been a walk of faith, if I can take all of that and combine it, then I am uniquely positioned to lead New York City into the greatest and most inclusive comeback that this city has ever known. I can make certain that those folks who look like me, especially those children, are given the opportunity, the same opportunity that you gave me and that education gave me, that we can finally make a difference in these children's lives, so that notwithstanding all the failed promises that have been brought up before, and I'm not a politician, that we can bring all that together to make certain that New York City is inclusive and is much better today than it has been in its history for Black and brown people. And she said, son, I'm gonna pray for you. And my mother's praying for me. And now I'm on the journey to accomplish just what we set out. So thank you. I look forward to earning your support, and I look forward to being here with you. And I so appreciate your scholarship and an in-depth, intelligent, and diligent question, Sean, and for all of you all who've given me the audience to be here to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Mr. Chang.
And by the way, you'll have to excuse me because I'm going to have to, excuse me,
Thank you, Mr. McGuire.
given where we are. So thank you.
Sean, thank you so much. I want to also just say congratulations and thank you to all the other candidates. I mean, New York is going to come back. And the question is, will it come back with more equity, and will it come back with more fairness? I think that with the ideas and with the folks who are around this screen, that we'll actually be able to have a good chance of doing that. I'm gonna go back to the quote I started with, where Albert Einstein said that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking used to create them. I bring different thinking to bring around real change. When we talk about how we set visions, how do we measure success? How do we think about a plan to get from here to there in an inclusive manner that is not a one-size-fits-all, that treats everybody as an individual and every community based upon its own needs? I think we can, and it's not because I have all the ideas, it's because the people around this screen do. In the city of 8.5 million people, we have experts, practitioners, frontline workers, and the communities themselves who can partner to actually make these visions happen. So thank you so much. I invite anyone to come to my open office hours. Go to chang.nyc. I have open office hours 7 days a week. I would love to see you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. Mr. Cullen.
First off, I just want to thank you guys. I really enjoyed this. I appreciate it. I put my email and the phone number of my campaign, which is the same date as the primary, 888-622-2021. So anyone can call at any time, and I'm going to pick up. You'll always hear from me directly. You will email me. I will directly be there. I'm down at 200 Broadway. I'm right across the street from City Hall in a WeWork. I moved my office down from Harlem. I'm going to be in the trenches doing the work. I don't come from wealth. I come from a New York City family, a 32 BJ worker. My mom worked at a small business. My uncle works for the MTA. My aunt works for Manhattan College, and I'm going to be here every day working as hard as I can, because to Carlos's point, we can do this right now. We can unlock the collaborative spirit of all 8.5 million New Yorkers through an inclusive capitalism model, and we can fix our problems right now. We don't need to wait for Superman. We can do this with all the people that we have, and we can do this together. There's no reason why not to. I am not a politician. I didn't plan on running for mayor. I was shocked into action because I sat there and I would go into a pizza shop and I'm not allowed to eat a pizza inside anymore. I'm not allowed to, I'm on the subway and I'm seeing more homeless than I ever have seen. So my heart has been broken, but I'm capable. And I think we need capable people right now. And that's everyone in the city, any candidate that wants to meet with me, anybody that has a different perspective, I'm going to meet with you. And that's just how it is. I promise you one thing, that I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to be human, but I will promise you that our core philosophy is I'm going to love this city back into unity.
Thank you very much. Ms. Morales.
Thank you, Sean. So, I got into this race because I believe that the combination of my lived and professional experiences have never been reflected in our city's leadership. A year ago, a little bit over a year ago, I thought that was going to be a really important factor in moving the city towards better representation of historically marginalized communities that was ultimately going to benefit everyone. But now, after living through 2020 and the intersection of the COVID pandemic with the racial justice and the economic pandemics that predate it, it really feels like there's a moral imperative for us to fundamentally shift how we operate and how we lead New York City moving forward. Mine are bold and radically different approaches to respond to a radically different time. We are at a crossroads, and it's really time for us to honor the essential frontline workers who continue to make it possible for the city to operate and for so many of us to work from home. There's a moral and a political imperative at this moment in time for us to really commit to creating a new social contract. I believe that we do that by recognizing our collective interdependence and orienting our policies towards providing and prioritizing the ability for people to live in dignity and to provide for their families. Ultimately, we all benefit from that. I want to thank you all for your time this afternoon, and I want to invite you all to please feel free to visit my website at diann.nyc, that's DIANN2Ns.NYC, for further information or to contribute to support the creation of a New York City that lives up to the rhetoric of being the greatest city in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Foldenauer.
Thank you, Sean. It's an honor to be here today and speak to the voters of Harlem and voters across this city. The city faces difficult times ahead, and as the next mayor, I am willing to make the difficult decisions that we're going to have to make to get our city moving again. We've been devastated by the pandemic. And if you think about the city, we have two big businesses. One is tourism, which brings in tens of billions of dollars per year. Our tourism business has been decimated. I have set forth a comprehensive plan to safely bring back tourists to our city. And secondly, most people don't know, Sean, and your voters in West Harlem and across the city, that in normal times, over 1.5 million people per day come to Manhattan, whether it is to go to work or see a Broadway show. Now that number is probably 10% of that. What that means is that it affects the whole ecosystem of our economy across our city, whether it's the local shoe shine guy, the barista, and those who work in hotels. So we must get our city moving again. And we must do it in such a way, as an environmental advocate, I'm passionate to say that we must do so in an environmentally friendly way. So again, my name is Aaron Foldenauer. I'm a candidate for mayor, and I look forward to working with you, your constituents there in Harlem, and voters across New York City.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Sean. My grandfather was one of 10 poor Irish kids growing up on the south side of London. And as a teenager, he worked the docks, left to work in Africa, in South America, made enough for my dad to be able to go to school. And my father, who grew up in Costa Rica and Lima, Peru, came to New York City because it was the city of the future, to find opportunity. And he did. But as a child, I also saw around me a city in crisis and too many families, particularly Black and brown families, not finding the opportunity that my father did. So I went to work. For 30 years, I've been a public servant, not a politician, starting in Harlem to rebuild those very same communities I'd seen crumbling and even burning as a child. And so when I was able to become a cabinet member for Barack Obama, my father came to me and said, "I'm ready, son. I'm finally ready to become a citizen." And I got to be the keynote speaker at his induction ceremony in the Great Hall on Ellis Island. I want every kid, no matter what they look like, where they come from, what language they speak, who they love, no matter where they live around the world, to believe, as my father did once again, that this can be a city of the future, that it can be a city that works, but for everyone. That's the city that I would build as mayor. And in a week where people around the world are wondering, not just if this city, but if this country can be a democracy that we pretend to be, that we say that we are, this is a moment when we need leadership in New York City that can make a city that works for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, the final words go to you, Councilman Menchaca.
Thanks again, Sean, and everyone here at the club. I'm Carlos Menchaca, and I want to be your next mayor. I've spent the last 15 years in public service here in the city of New York. In this municipal government, I understand how it works and how it can work better. You can go to my website, carlos2021.com, sign up, donate. I am running a progressive campaign. This means that I'm taking low dollar donations, grassroots donations, donations from people across the entire city. That's what's going to be fueling me, not Rebney and developers or corporate PACs. That's what's going to make this campaign very different. And I'm just so thankful and full of gratitude for this conversation today, because I know I learned a few things. And I'm hoping that this long stretch to June gives us the opportunity not just to build a people's agenda, but to actualize it. And as a council member, I have the role and responsibility to take these ideas and make them happen in the people's chamber right now. And hope that we can work together as as mayoral candidates in this city council. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to more conversations. carlos2021.com. Thank you.
I want to thank all the candidates today, those who left and those who are currently still on. I really appreciate your time, as does West Harlem and as does the West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club. Thank you, Mr. Foldenauer, Ms. Morales, Mr. Donovan, Mr. Chang, and Councilman Menchaca. I wish you all the best in this race, as you all are excellent candidates. Please, please, please make sure everyone, you get out to vote. June 21st is the Democratic primary for the race. Please get out to vote. Spread the word to get out the vote. I want to thank you all again for your time and what was a very lengthy but important and very necessary conversation today. So thank you all, and I wish you best of luck again. Please stay safe. Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Sean.
you.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe,
Sean.
stay healthy.
Thanks for doing your homework, Sean.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Big
guys.
elbow bump to everyone. Take care.
Thank you.